Good afternoon. We are back on the record on dockets number 2023-8E and 2023-10E, the Integrated Resource Plan for the Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress. All commissioners are present in the courtroom as well as all necessary parties. I think we're at a point now where we're looking at whether or not Office of Regulatory Staff has redirect for their witness.
It's very, very brief, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And you're still under oath, Mr. Salter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this may not even qualify as redirect. What is now exhibit number 17, that's been admitted, which is the list of the dockets. For purposes of just clarification and clarity, I'd ask that the Commission take judicial notice of ORS's testimony in each of those dockets.
Certainly. We will take notice of that.
Thank you, and that's all we have.
Okay. Well, Mr. Salter, you're excused for now. Anyway. ORS next witness. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair. ORS would next call Leah Welburn to the stand, and she should be here remotely.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Welburn, would you raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. Your witness.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Ms. Welburn. Could you please state your name, business address, and occupation for the record?
My name is Leah Welborn. I am a manager of consulting at J. Kennedy & Associates. My business address is 570 Colonial Park Drive, Suite 305, Roswell, Georgia, 30075.
Thank you. And Commissioner Thomas requested yesterday, you will be back up again for rebuttal testimony. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Thank you. Are you the same Leah Welburn who prepared or caused to be prepared 11 pages of pre-filed direct testimony in these dockets on July 1st, 2024?
Yes.
Do you have any changes, edits, or corrections to your pre-filed direct testimony?
No, I do not.
If I were to ask you those same questions as posed in your pre-filed direct testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Chair Powers, ORS would request the pre-filed direct testimony of Ms. Welburn be read into the record as if given orally from the stand.
The pre-filed direct testimony of Ms. Welburn will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you. Ms. Welburn, did you pre-file with your direct testimony one exhibit marked Exhibit LJW-1?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes, edits, or corrections to that exhibit?
No, I do not.
Chair Powers, I would ask that Ms. Welburn's Exhibit LJW-1 be marked for identification and entered into the record as the next hearing exhibit.
The pre-filed exhibit of witness Welburn identified as LJW-1 is marked for identification and will be placed in the record as exhibit number 18.
Thank you. Ms. Welburn, did you prepare a summary of your pre-filed direct testimony?
Yes, I did.
Would you please deliver that now?
Of course. Good afternoon, Commissioners. The purpose of my direct testimony was to provide additional context and support for 8 recommendations that were identified in the ORS report. My direct testimony addressed the company's load forecast, DSM sensitivities, commodity forecasts, renewable energy modeling, and Encompass benchmarking. I will now provide a summary of the 8 recommendations made in my direct testimony. Recommendation B1 relates to the ongoing monitoring of economic development load and tracking of the economic development load project pipeline. ORS recommended annual reporting related to customer project demand and energy requirements and an analysis of the changes in that forecast over time. Recommendation B2 relates to the energy and demand forecasts. ORS recommended Duke Energy discuss load forecasting methodology including the economic development load, electric vehicle loads, and behind-the-meter solar photovoltaic loads in the stakeholder working group. ORS also recommended Duke Energy consider changes to its methodology to consider a reasonable range of forecasts over the short term and the long term. Recommendation D1 relates to the forecasting of hydrogen availability, blending, and pricing, given the early stages of the industry and supply chain. ORS recommended Duke Energy discuss hydrogen assumptions in the stakeholder working group. Recommendation E1 relates to renewable energy effective load carrying capability, or ELCC modeling. ORS recommended Duke Energy revise its ELCC modeling in the 2025 IRP update and to discuss future improvements to ELCC modeling in the stakeholder working group. Recommendation E2 relates to Duke Energy's modeling of solar resources. ORS recommends Duke Energy comply with Commission Order Number 2023-189 to model both company-owned and power purchase agreement PPA solar as selectable resource options and not arbitrarily limit the selection of PPA solar resources in the 2025 IRP update. ORS is concerned that Duke Energy is not modeling the most economic representation of solar resources. Further, in supplying the sensitivity portfolio case with solar modeled as PPAs, ORS remains concerned that Duke Energy did not meet the full requirements of the order. Recommendation E3 relates to federal incentives and possible energy infrastructure reinvestment loan program opportunities. ORS recommended Duke Energy discuss updates related to these opportunities and incorporate any modeling adjustments into the 2025 IRP update. Recommendation E4 relates to the modeling of the Clean Air Act Section 111 sensitivities presented in the IRP. ORS recommended additional modeling be provided in the 2025 IRP update consistent with the final rule. And finally, recommendation G1, ORS recommended Duke Energy be required to conduct production cost model benchmark studies on an ongoing basis, such as every 3 years ahead of the comprehensive IRP proceedings, and report those results in the stakeholder working group. Benchmarking is consistent with current IRP expectations for Dominion Energy, South Carolina, and benchmarking is performed periodically as an industry practice. As the composition of the grid changes over time, benchmarking efforts provide assurance that the modeling assumptions accurately reflect real-time operations, providing value to the IRP process. And this concludes my summary.
Thank you, Ms. Welborn. Chair Powers, Ms. Welborn is available for cross-examination.
Thank you, sir. Duke?
All right. Good afternoon, Ms. Wellborn. I think you'll.
Good afternoon.
Ah, there you are. Nice to see you. Brett Bright, short on behalf of the Duke companies. How are you today?
Good. Happy
Good.
to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us remotely. I've just got a few questions for you about your testimony. First, want to start with a little bit of background. This is the first IRP for the Duke companies that you've reviewed. Is that correct?
I think it's the first comprehensive. I believe I reviewed some of the IRP update, the 2022.
Okay, thank you. And so you've also participated in the review and appeared as a witness, I believe, in the most recent Dominion IRP proceeding and the Santee Cooper proceeding as well. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And did you have an opportunity to participate in Duke's IRP stakeholder engagement process that preceded the filing of this IRP? Would have been last summer and spring?
Not personally. I do believe ORS does participate.
Okay. And when did you start working on the project?
On this comprehensive IRP?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, when it was filed. So I've been a part of the project the entire
Okay.
time.
So August of 2023. All right.
Yes.
Very good. And have you participated in stakeholder working groups for other South Carolina utilities?
I have attended some meetings. I'm not a primary, it's not one of my primary responsibilities.
Okay. And in your review of the IRP, I know you have specific areas that you focused on in the report. Did you comprehensively review the documents?
The documents for the stakeholder working group, or the documents just
The
filed in
company's
the
IRP. Yes, ma'am.
I yes, I reviewed the documents.
Did you read all of Appendix C, quantitative analysis?
Yes.
That is impressive.
I was gonna say I can't say that I've hit every single page of every single document, but I definitely spent time on Appendix C.
All right, thank you. And recognize that you haven't spent time in the Duke stakeholder working group process. Do you have a perspective on how Duke's IRP stacked up? Do you feel like it was comprehensive and provided a detailed overview of the company's plans, portfolio, the support for technologies, the near-term actions the companies are proposing to pursue relative to the other utilities presenting plans to the Commission in South Carolina?
I'm going to try to take that a bite at a time.
Sure.
The evaluation you presented was comprehensive. The initial filing, I think, had 33 portfolios submitted, and then we got, this new load forecast and on this economic development load, and so we had additional portfolios. So to the extent that there is a lot of information and a lot of data to review and rely on, I think that is accurate. To the extent that the portfolio presented and the actions presented have, been discussed and aligned as, I don't know what term you just used.
Comprehensive.
Comprehensive. I think the analysis is comprehensive. Whether or not the final plan, meets all of the Commission's requirements and the balancing factors, I think that's still to be determined.
Okay, and when the company presented their 2020 IRP, there was testimony from Jay Kennedy that it was a highly sophisticated plan, and I can tell you there were some planners that were a little disappointed they didn't get that again this time. So we appreciate that it was at least comprehensive and well designed and provided all the information needed to review. So I want to turn now to your testimony on the load forecast starting at page 4. Do you have that there?
Of my direct testimony?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I do have it.
Thank you. I'm going to try to put it up on the screen here just for... All right, so starting on page 4 and then over to page 5, you address the progression of the load forecast and how the company's load forecast evolved from the initial plan to the supplemental planning analysis. Is that the focus of your testimony there?
Yes, that is one of the focuses of this Q&A to describe the change in the load forecast related to the economic development load.
Right. And so at page 5, starting at line 5, you highlight that between the initial load forecast, which was the spring 2023 forecast, and the supplemental planning analysis load forecast, which was prepared in the fall of 23, the companies now expect an additional 1,000 megawatts in peak demand by 2028. You see that?
Yes.
And just for
Yes.
context, would you say that is a very significant increase in the load forecast in a very short period of time?
I would. I mean, we're sitting here in 2024, and we know how long it takes for resources to be procured, and 1,000 megawatts is not inconsequential.
Are you familiar with other utilities that are planning for such a significant increase in their load forecast in that immediate term through 2028 or near term?
We're seeing increased economic development load in other territories on a short-term basis, yes.
Okay. And you addressed this in your testimony later, but would you agree that the primary driver of that increase in the load forecast was the new economic development loads, those 27 large projects that were 20 megawatts or greater that have made material commitments to the company to take service in both South Carolina and North Carolina?
Right. The initial filing, I think, identified 8, and then the supplemental identified additional. So, yes, 24.
And Mr. Salter mentioned this earlier, that the ORS asked discovery on those projects and was able to analyze the whether the projects had made commitments, where they were in the pipeline of progression of moving from an initial phase of interest in the Carolinas to actually committing to take service, either signing a letter of intent or an energy service agreement. Were you familiar with that? Were you part of that process of reviewing those documents?
Yes, I was involved. So we received some information in discovery with masked data. And so I was able to evaluate the adjustments to the load forecast, the magnitude of the customers, and the status of each customer. And then I believe the ORS team in South Carolina actually went to the Duke offices to review the specific, customer data, customer names, and contracts of that nature. So I was involved, but may not have done the specific task you're discussing.
Thank you. But based on your analysis, the projects that the companies identified seem to be real projects that the companies need to plan for, and that's why you highlighted that significant 1,000 megawatts of new load that the companies, or new peak demand that the companies need to plan for by 2028. Is that fair?
Yeah, yes, I believe that's fair.
Okay. So moving on to lines 7 and 8 of your testimony, you say, given this large change in the near-term load forecast, ORS recognizes the impacts of economic development can be swift and quickly change the company's near-term action plan. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. And so why did you include that in your testimony? What was the cause of the company, of highlighting the company's near-term action plan may need to change as a result of this new load forecast?
Well, I think there's really two parts of this. So the first is the recognition that these changes in contracts or customer expectations can change, and that was really the part of the request for additional reporting. Like, we want to see those changes happening as we can. And then to the extent that it can change the company's near-term action plan, this is just getting at the idea that if you are expected to meet load by 2028, actions are likely needed to be taken in the near term.
Right. Thank you. And so I've put on the Elmo screen here, if you can see that. This is figure SCS1, which is the South Carolina chapter supplement that highlights, I think this was up on the screen before the commission earlier in the week, but this is the projection of the change in the the load forecast, driven by the impact of these new large economic development projects. Do you see that there?
I do.
And I've highlighted the sentence under that, which I'll read it out. These changes materially impact the company's proposed near-term action plan and longer-term resource plan to reliably serve customers. Do you see that?
I do.
And have you read this chapter SC supplement?
I believe I have.
Okay. And it seems like the companies in the ORS are saying the same thing, that there are critical actions that need to be taken in the near term to ensure the company has sufficient capacity and energy resources to reliably serve the existing and the new load on the system. Is that accurate?
It is accurate. I think it's ORS recommendation F1, even requested specific actions in the near term being taken to meet load and reliability targets. And so ORS is definitely watching that issue develop.
Okay. And so specific to your testimony, you were responsible for analyzing the renewable energy and energy storage were incorporated in the plan.
I discussed the renewable energy assumptions.
Okay. So
think
did you review? I'm sorry. Go ahead. Please finish.
No. If that's your question, was your question to the assumptions or to the plan?
To the near-term action plans and the forecast, did you have any review or analysis of how those renewable energy resources, whether it was solar or battery storage or wind, were developed and meet the new energy and capacity needs that this updated load forecast has identified? I mean, that's the key takeaway, would you agree, of the supplemental chapter SC is that there's significant new load growth and we have a new near-term action plan to fully meet those resource needs.
Objection. Chair Powers, I would just request that he ask the witness one question at a time, please.
Well, that makes sense.
Okay, I can reframe the question. Ms. Welborn, would you agree that stepping back, you were responsible for the renewable forecasts in the plan, correct? For evaluating the renewable forecasts in the plan.
I think the Kennedy team, we all are reviewing the inputs and the plan outputs. So to the extent that we're talking about the inputs on whether the solar interconnection limits or the solar pricing or onshore wind pricing, those were collaborative issues that, the whole Kennedy team worked on. And then the plan that came out, again, was collaboratively reviewed, but I think it was actually more under Mr. Hayet's testimony in the discussion of the preferred portfolio.
Okay, so do you have an opinion on whether the renewable energy and the energy storage resources in that near-term action plan are reasonable and appropriate to meet the updated load forecast? Is that within the scope of your testimony, or is that not something that you're able to opine on today?
I think part of it is, and so maybe I can answer it this way. We're seeing solar and batteries selected across many of the portfolios presented. I mean, we're seeing it in the preferred portfolio as well as the alternative portfolio. So to the extent that, the companies are going to be procuring, additional solar and batteries using their competitive procurement CPRE process, I think those paths are relatively consistent across all the portfolios. Okay. So I guess as a near-term action, I don't know if I am weighing in on a specific amount or a specific target or anything like that.
Okay, so Mr. Hayet would be the witness to weigh in on that specific amount and whether it is appropriate. Is that accurate?
But possibly. I think it's part of the overall theme of this proceeding, right? Which is, what is the resource plan to be preferred? And so hopefully that resource plan provides some context for those decisions. But to the extent that we're trying to address the specific near-term action plan, I don't think I have a specific position, and I'm not sure if Mr. Hayet will, but.
Okay, thank you. Could you turn to page 10 of your testimony, please? Recommendation E4.
Yes.
And I just have some general questions. This is the recommendation around the company's proposed modeling related to Clean Air Act 111, the proposed regulations. See that?
Yes.
And you're generally familiar with the final rule. You addressed it in your testimony, and I think in your rebuttal as well.
Yes.
Generally. And have you reviewed the Clean Air Act sensitivity analysis sponsored by Mr. Quinto?
In his rebuttal, yes, I have.
Okay. And does this meet the request or recommendation that ORS made in your testimony to, in the next 2025 RP update, to address a Clean Air Act 111 analysis, that modeling that he performed?
The rebuttal analysis Mr. Quinto presented, we did a limited review of it. I think what was presented in the company's initial filing, there was a sensitivity case meeting compliance under a P3 scenario, and then the Quinto rebuttal included a number of sensitivity cases to try to address the Clean Air Act rule. So yes, I think that type of analysis is what we would have hoped for in a 25 IRP update, as I've recommended in my direct.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you.
Sierra Club,
No questions, thank you.
say CCL.
No questions.
Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association.
No questions.
Walmart.
No questions, thank you.
All right. Now then we'll have commissioner questions. Any questions by commissioners? Seeing none, we would resort to ask questions after the rebuttal.
Thank you.
Would you like her excuse for now?
Yes, Chair. Thank you.
All right. You may stand down, Ms. Welborn, for now.
Chair, just one point of order, if you won't mind. It's getting a little late in the day, and I'm a little fuzzy-headed, perhaps. But did you also state that Mr. Finley Salter could stand down as well? If not,
Yes,
we'd
I did.
request. Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. And Mr. Burns. I tell you, I'll give you 10. We'll come back at 5 till 3. Thank you. Welcome back. We are on the record for dockets number 2023 8E and 2023 10E, the integrated resource plans of the Duke companies. We are now, all commissioners are present. It appears that all parties are present, and we are now ready for further examination. I think it's now the turn of Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association. Is that correct?
That's correct. SECIBA's ready. We thank you for your indulgence.
Sure.
And SECIBA calls its two panel witnesses, Hamilton Davis and Michael Haggerty.
All right. Come forward, gentlemen, be sworn.
Both please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you.
Chair Powers, if you're ready. We want to put on the record that both of these witnesses for SECIBA only have direct testimony.
Thank you very much.
And we'll start with Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, please state your name and business address.
Hamilton Davis, 1519 King Street, Charleston, South Carolina, 29401.
By whom are you employed in what capacity?
I am the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for Energy RE.
And you've testified before this commission before.
I have.
Who are you testifying on behalf of today?
The Carolinas Clean Energy Business Association, or CCBA.
Did you prepare or cause to be prepared pre-filed direct testimony consisting of 9 pages?
I did.
Do you have changes or corrections to your pre-filed direct?
I do not.
If I ask you the same questions today as in your pre-filed direct, would your answers be the same?
They would be.
Chair Powers, we'd like to move the direct testimony of witness Davis into the record as if given orally from the stand.
The direct testimony, Mr. Davis, will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you. Have you prepared a summary of your testimony, Mr. Davis?
Yes, I have.
Can you present that testimony? Can you present that summary?
I will. My name is Hamilton Davis, and I currently serve as the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for Energy RE, where I manage the company's regulatory engagements before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and multiple state utility commissions, including the South Carolina Public Service Commission and the North Carolina Public Utilities Commission. My work also supports the company's policy initiatives before various state legislatures, as well as the company's commercial interest in wholesale and vertically integrated markets across the country. I also serve on the board of the Carolinas Clean Energy Business Association, and I am co-chair of CCBA's Regulatory Committee. My direct testimony discusses state, regional, and national energy trends related to coal retirement and the deployment of solar and storage resources. I also discuss the requirements of South Carolina Act 62 and their implications for the Duke IRP. With regard to accelerated coal retirement, I provide an overview of Dominion Energy's Commission-approved 2023 IRP, which includes the early retirement of all coal capacity on the Dominion system by 2031, as well as Santee Cooper's Commission-approved 2023 IRP that includes the early retirement of the Winyah coal facility by 2031. Further, I highlight the plans of Florida Power and Light to retire all of its coal facilities by 2027, and Georgia Power's plans to retire all of its coal facilities by 2035. Notably, none of these regionally comparable utilities are operating in jurisdictions that have adopted statutory decarbonization requirements. Finally, I discussed the nationwide coal retirement trends that will result in only 36% of coal capacity remaining online by 2030, as compared to the country's peak coal capacity in 2011, as well as the economic, reliability, and regulatory challenges that have made coal an increasingly undependable and cost-prohibitive generation source. With regard to solar and storage resources, I discussed the national trends associated with large annual deployments of solar and storage resources across the country and within the region. In 2024, over half of new capacity projected to come online will be solar and 23% will be battery storage. I also provide a comparison of the solar and storage resources proposed in the 2023 Duke IRP to those same resources for Dominion, Santee Cooper, Florida Power and Light, and Georgia Power. This comparison demonstrates that although Duke's 2023 IRP is directionally consistent with these regional peer utilities, the amount of solar proposed by Duke lags behind these other utilities, while the amount of storage proposed by Duke is consistent with both Dominion and Florida Power and Light. With regard to the requirements of Act 62, I testify that the accelerated coal retirements and additions of solar and storage resources included in Duke's IRP are consistent with the factors included in the Act and reflect broader industry trends within South Carolina, the region, and across the country. Further, this commission has found accelerated coal retirements and significant additions of solar and storage resources to be key factors for South Carolina utilities in meeting the statute's most reasonable and prudent standard of review. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Haggerty, please state your name and business address.
My name is John Michael Haggerty. My business address is 1800 M Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20036.
By whom are you employed in what capacity?
I am a principal at the Brattle Group.
Have you testified before this commission before?
I have not.
Okay. Who are you testifying on behalf of today?
The Carolinas Clean Energy Business Association, CCBA.
Okay. Do you recall that portions of your pre-filed direct testimony had confidential portions?
Yes.
And you also recall that we prepared a confidential version of your testimony, which was hand-delivered to this commission and in compliance with their protocol?
Yes.
Okay. Did you prepare or cause to be prepared pre-filed direct testimony consisting of 47 pages?
Yes.
Did you have any changes or corrections?
No.
If I ask you those same questions as was in your pre-filed direct, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Chair Powers, we'd like to move the public pre-filed direct testimony of witness Haggerty into the record as if given orally for the stand, and also ask that the confidential version of his direct testimony be kept under seal.
The pre-filed direct testimony of Mr. Haggerty will be entered into the record if given orally from the stand, both standard copy and the confidential copy, and confidential will remain so as long as necessary.
Thank you, Chair Powers. Mr. Haggerty, did you prepare one exhibit called designated as JMH1?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections to that exhibit?
I do not.
Chair Powers, we'd like to move exhibit JMH1 into the record.
Exhibit of witness Haggerty, known as JMH1, is marked for identification and will place in the record as exhibit number 19.
Thank you. Mr. Haggerty, do you have a summary of your testimony?
I do.
Can you present that at this time?
Certainly. Good afternoon. I address three primary points in my direct testimony concerning Duke's filed resource portfolios. First, I demonstrate, based on Duke's resource planning simulations, that solar and battery storage are essential resources in low-cost, low-risk portfolios to serve future customer demands. Second, I identify opportunities for Duke to further improve its transmission planning and generator interconnection processes to lower customer bills. Third, I summarize how the volume and pace of solar and battery storage additions in Duke's portfolios, as well as proactive transmission planning, are in the best interest of Duke's ratepayers and consistent with South Carolina's requirements regarding reasonable and prudent resource planning. I will summarize my testimony supporting these 3 points and look forward to answering any questions concerning my testimony. First, starting with the addition of solar and storage. All 4 of Duke's proposed resource portfolios include significant solar and battery storage additions. Specifically, the portfolios include 11.8 gigawatts to 14.9 gigawatts of solar and 4.3 gigawatts to 6.7 gigawatts of battery storage by 2035. Duke remains cost-effective. Solar remains cost-effective after accounting for the recent increase in solar costs, as reflected in the 2023 solar RFP submissions. Notably, Duke projects long-term trends in solar and storage capital costs differently from other resources in its analysis. While gas-fired resource costs return to previously projected costs by 2026, Duke assumes that solar and storage remain elevated relative to earlier projections. This treatment is inconsistent as there are several common cost drivers among technologies. The volumes included in the portfolios reflect the fact that solar is the least cost generation resource currently being deployed at scale in the Duke system and the rest of South Carolina. Solar additions provide low cost generation to the system and a hedge against the bill impacts of volatile natural gas commodity prices. I estimate that Duke's portfolios with significant solar capacity reduce ratepayer costs by $2 billion in a high gas price scenario, compared to a portfolio with limited solar additions. Solar resources are so cost effective that Duke's simulations add as much solar capacity as possible and would economically select even more solar if allowed to do so. However, Duke caps the annual volume of solar additions based on what it states are the operational limitations of interconnecting new capacity to the grid. Taking a broader view across the industry, the trends in solar development in South Carolina reflect those that I'm observing across the country. The addition of large volumes of solar is a key feature of future low-cost, low-risk portfolios, both in states with and without specific renewable energy policy goals. The simulations conducted by Duke also demonstrate that battery storage is a cost-effective resource. Battery storage supports the system by charging during periods of lower cost generation and discharging during periods of high demand. The simulations add battery storage both as a standalone resource and paired with solar to achieve Duke's annual reserve requirements, with annual additions varying year to year depending on coal retirements, natural gas additions, and load growth. My second point concerns transmission planning and interconnection processes. Currently, the Duke system is perpetually constrained when adding new resources. Duke must play a time-consuming game of catch-up to identify and build transmission upgrades after new resources request interconnection. Duke's current approach limits the rate at which new solar can be added, as demonstrated by the modeling limits on solar additions. Strategic and proactive transmission planning could address the lack of available capacity on the system and reduce transmission costs by identifying and constructing needed least regrets upgrades. I highlight in my direct testimony recent improvements that Duke has made through the development of Red Zone Expansion Plan RZEP transmission projects and the addition of the Multi-Value Strategic Transmission MVST planning process. The RZEP projects are upgrades that Duke identified as necessary and cost-effective across multiple generator interconnection studies to accommodate new low-cost generation resources. The MVST planning process is a framework for taking the next step, moving from reactive planning to an integrated and proactive approach that unlocks more value to the transmission system by leveraging economies of scale of larger upgrades and scenario-based planning to identify investments where they will deliver the most value. Both of these changes will support Duke in achieving its future resource needs at least cost to customers and reduce the complexity, costs, and timeline of generator interconnection processes. While these improvements are commendable, Duke has more to do. The RZEP projects will support future interconnection, but only reflect the system needs for the scale and location of resources included in recent interconnection studies. Relying on the near-term bottom-up process for generation-related upgrades will not identify the longer-term needs of the system and opportunities to build up the system at scale. The Carolinas Transmission Planning Collaborative, CTPC, 2023 Public Policy Study demonstrated that value, showing that cost-effective upgrades for incorporating 14.5 gigawatts of future solar and wind resources, which is similar to Duke's P3 fall-based portfolio, would cost less than Duke assumed in its simulations for interconnecting new solar resources. However, the 2023 public policy study did not result in a plan to build out the transmission system to meet the future needs. That is where effective implementation of Duke's new MVST process could help. The MVST process has the potential to identify and build cost-effective transmission upgrades that, 1, incorporate the full set of resources needed to achieve future system demand, consider a broader range of cost savings enabled by transmission upgrades, and 3, create headroom on the system in advance of resources seeking interconnection, reducing costs, reducing costly uncertainty and schedule delays. This kind of proactive transmission planning study has yielded benefits for ratepayers across the country, including transmission planning studies by the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO, and the Southwest Power Pool SPP. My colleagues and I at the Brattle Group, along with collaborators at Grid Strategies, have summarized the best practices from these and other regions in a report that I referenced in my direct testimony. Duke should leverage demonstrated best practices in proactive transmission planning to reduce costs and increase the reliability of its system. Duke's initial MVST study, which is currently underway, provides an excellent opportunity to put these recommendations into action to the benefit of Duke's ratepayers. To that end, I provide several specific recommendations in my direct testimony on how Duke can effectively implement its MVST, and I recommend that the Commission oversee and scrutinize, as needed, implementation of the MVST to ensure that cost-effective upgrades are identified and constructed. On my final point, the volume and pace of solar and battery storage additions in Duke's portfolios are key components of any resource plan to maintain a reliable power system and balance costs and risks for ratepayers consistent with 5 of the factors in South Carolina's Act 62 balancing test. Effective implementation of proactive transmission planning will amplify each of these benefits by increasing access to a broader set of resources, particularly during challenging market conditions and lowering costs. For resource adequacy, solar and battery storage increase capacity to serve peak load and contribute to meeting the planning reserve margin. Solar and storage contribute nearly 5,000 megawatts to the winter planning reserve margin and 10,000 megawatts to the summer reserve margin. Second, on affordability, solar and battery storage provide low-cost energy to meet future electricity demand that contribute to preserving customer affordability, particularly when integrated with a multi-driver proactive transmission planning process. Third, on power supply reliability, battery storage provides highly flexible capacity that can respond faster than other resources to short-term disturbances and provides fast response operating reserves in the event of a planned outage. Fourth, on commodity price risks, solar lessens the exposure of Duke customers to natural gas price volatility. Fifth, on state and federal environmental regulations, the current Duke IRP portfolios do not yet consider the impacts of the EPA's standards to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for new natural gas-fired combustion turbines and existing coal-fired and natural gas-fired resources. Standards likely will significantly limit the output of new and existing gas-fired and coal-fired resources. The addition of solar and battery storage combined with proactive transmission planning will be crucial to compliance with the new federal standards while maintaining a cost-effective and reliable power system. This concludes the summary of my direct testimony.
Thank you. Chair Powers, Sesebus panel is available for questions.
Thank you, sir. Duke, any questions?
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Brett Breitschwert, on behalf of Duke Energy Carolinas, Duke Energy Progress. Mr. Davis, I have a few questions for you first and then a few for Mr. Haggerty after that. So I want to start off with the general purpose of your testimony, which you discussed in your summary and addressed on page 3 to discuss state, regional, national energy sector trends related to 2 topics, coal retirements and then deployment of solar and storage.
Okay.
So why did you feel it was appropriate and beneficial to the commission to look beyond Duke's IRP in evaluating coal retirements and planned deployment of solar and storage? Why did you frame your testimony in that way?
I mean, probably 2 reasons. I think what we've seen over the last, these trends have been accelerating around low growth, customer preferences, the viability of coal across the marketplace in the United States. The economics of these different resources continue to change. And I think especially given the magnitude of what's in the Duke IRP. It's important to put that in context for the commission and for purposes of this review. And so looking at those national trends, looking within the state, around the region, I thought was useful context for understanding what Duke has proposed as compared to these peer utilities. I think second, a lot of conversation around the North Carolina Carbon Plan. And I think from our perspective, this movement towards coal retirement, increased deployment of clean energy resources is really happening in markets regardless of whether you see carbon constraints required, and didn't want that to be a distraction from the what I would consider progress in the Duke IRP as compared to more recent filings.
Okay. So I want to start off with your first topic, pages 3 and 4, where you talk about and use the term accelerated coal retirements across the country. Do you recall that?
I do use that term.
I can give you a specific line, page 5, line 10. You seem to suggest that similar to other utilities across the country, Duke has framed its plan as accelerating its own coal unit retirements. Do you see that?
I do.
All right. Did you hear Mr. Verderrame's testimony yesterday afternoon to the commission?
I did.
And did you hear where he took issue with the use of the term expedited or similar to your term accelerated to describe the company's coal retirement analysis?
I did hear that.
And he framed Duke's coal retirement analysis as optimized and primarily focused on economics and reliability based on detailed production cost modeling. Did you recall that?
I do.
And would you agree based on, or sorry, let me start with this. Have you reviewed Appendix F to the company's plan, which is a coal retirement analysis section?
I have reviewed all of the company's plan when it was filed, but I have not looked at that section recently.
Okay. And do you recall, and I can refresh your recollection with the overall process, but that it was a detailed modeling process the companies used to analyze the most economic dates for coal retirements? This was figure F1 from the company's initial plan.
Yeah, I'm generally familiar with the process, and this seems to represent it.
Okay, so when you used accelerated, that was a general term that was an industry framing and not something that was specific to Duke's coal retirement analysis that Mr. Quinto supports in the plan.
Yeah, I think we've been talking about coal retirements for a long time in the Carolinas, and I think if you go back, 5 years, 10 years, it wasn't clear when some of that capacity was coming offline. The fact that it's, all of our utilities are now taking this capacity offline, in my mind, it still represents something like accelerated retirement. But yeah, my word, not Duke's, and I don't mean for it to implicate that these decisions aren't being primarily driven from a reliability and economic perspective.
Okay, thank you. So let me, you said we've been talking about this for a long time. Let me try this a different way. So we're here in a resource planning proceeding that's focused on the resources the companies plan to retire and then plan to construct to replace that retiring capacity. Is that generally fair?
That's right.
And we've been pretty clear in this proceeding. I think the companies and ORS has made this point that this is not a rate-making proceeding, but the other place that coal retirements are evaluated is in the context of a rate case where you're assessing the remaining useful life of the generating facility. Would you agree with that?
As I understand it, yes.
Okay. And would you agree that one of the inputs to establishing base rates for utilities in South Carolina is to determine the remaining useful life of a generating facility, coal plant or otherwise?
Again, as I understand it, that's correct.
Okay. So one of the ongoing discussions perhaps has been how many years left in the useful life of these aging coal plants. Would you agree with that?
That sounds right.
Okay. And so in the context of a rate case, the companies have to present and the commission ultimately has to approve depreciation schedules to establish the rates that will be based on the remaining useful life of the facility. Is that accurate? Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce an exhibit at this time.
Could you identify what this exhibit is?
Yes, sir. So, Mr. Davis, we spoke about the company's most recent rate cases generally, and the fact that the depreciation studies that inform those base rates ultimately have to make a determination of what is the most appropriate retirement date for those power plants. I think that was your testimony a moment ago.
Right.
And so one of the points about whether coal retirements are quote unquote accelerated is informed by whether it's generally consistent with the timeline in which this commission has determined coal retirements would be appropriate from a rate making perspective in establishing depreciation rates. Do you find that to be reasonable?
It sounds reasonable.
Let me enter. This is a timeline chart that you're introducing, and
Yes, sir.
I just need to give it a number. It's exhibit number 20.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
Appreciate that, sir. And the companies have developed this timeline to address.
I'm sorry. Is this supposed to be for coal? Because mine says nuclear.
I think you may have the wrong. These are all nuclear units. Does it say Allen 1 through 5 down the left side?
I've got it now. Thank you.
Oh, very good. We're not planning to retire those for a long time. Yes, ma'am. That's all right. Sorry, if you allow me one moment. All right, and so this analysis represents the comparison of the in-service dates, the depreciation study, the useful life and proposed conclusion of that useful life from a depreciation perspective, and then how that compares to the company's proposed retirement dates based on the coal retirement analysis presented in this proceeding. That's represented in the South Con depreciation study comparison to the 2023 IRP P3 fall base columns. Do you see that?
I see it.
And these depreciation rates and the years were established based on the company's most recent rate cases before this commission in 2023 and 2024.
Okay.
And would you agree with me that there's not a lot of daylight between the two? That they are generally consistent and that the company's not accelerated coal retirements in this resource plan relative to the most recent depreciation rates and the end of the useful life of these facilities?
Yeah, the depreciation dates match up fairly closely with the P3 fall base.
And even some of these plants have a economic life based on the IRP that extends beyond the depreciation rates approved by the commission. If you look at Roxborough 2 and 3, for example.
Yep, I see that.
Okay, thank you. So just to clarify from a perspective of both resource planning as well as rate making, the companies are generally aligned in the planned timing of coal unit retirements and hasn't accelerated those retirements in this proceeding.
Yeah, and again, I think my use of the term "accelerated" was not meant to be an industry term of art. It's more colloquial, and I don't disagree with how you framed this.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'd like to move on to the second half of your testimony, which is focused on trends in the solar development in the Southeast.
Okay.
And so you address this on page 5 through 7, and you have a nice chart here that identifies comparability of the amount of solar being added across the peer utilities as you refer to them in your testimony.
Yep.
And you essentially, and I think you said this in your summary, suggest that the companies are lagging behind, or I think you say at lines 4 and 5 of page 7 are significantly lower than peer utilities such as Dominion, Santee, Georgia Power, FPL. Do I see that correctly?
I remember using the term lag, but would point to me where
Page 7, line 4.
Yes, I see that.
Okay. And so just maybe some foundational information. So you developed this chart based on comparing the IRPs of the various utilities to the Duke IRP presented in this case.
That's right.
And is it fair to say that the Duke system in that first column, system load, is significantly larger than any of the other utilities that you've identified here?
It's a good bit larger. It looks like FP&L is closest.
Fair enough, but Georgia Power, it's double the size. Peak load, it's 5 to 6 times the size of Dominion system.
That's right.
Okay, and so in terms of the megawatts that the companies are planning and targeting procuring through 2035, would you agree that Duke is, with the exception of FPL, planning to procure more solar megawatts than any of the other utilities?
In terms of megawatts, that's correct.
Okay, so it's not so much lagging behind, it's just planning to meet the needs of the Duke system based on the comprehensive resource planning that was completed by the companies in the IRP.
Yes.
Okay. And this framing as the comparison you presented was through 2035. And why did you use 2035 as a reference point versus through 2038, which is the end of the company's resource planning period in this IRP?
The way these various utilities project out into the future, some of them were more limited than others. I think FP&L only went out to 2033. Georgia Power numbers, FP&L's 2033. I don't think I had numbers beyond that. So I was trying to just find a comparable date that was represented in each of the IRPs so that the difference in years didn't distort the comparison.
Okay. Specific to the South Carolina utilities, would it be helpful to the commission to have a comparison through 2038 in your mind? That's the end of the company's base planning period in this proceeding?
It certainly could be. I actually don't. Yeah, it could be. I'm not carving off 25 through 38. Was not done for any reason other than the convenience of these dates. And off the top of my head, I'm not actually sure what would change if you included those 3 years.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce another exhibit if I could, please.
All right. This chart looks like it's 3 pages. It's pure utility capacity mix. It will be exhibit number 21.
Thank you, sir. So, Mr. Davis, recognizing that the company, or let me put that there so it's on the Elmo. recognizing the company's IRP extends through 2038 and the commission is evaluating whether it's the most reasonable and prudent plan for that full planning horizon, do you think it's appropriate, as I mentioned earlier, to assess the relative comparability of the Duke system to the other utility systems in South Carolina over that full planning horizon?
I think using 2038 there's nothing inappropriate about that.
Okay. And making this comparison here, which is informed by Dominion Energy South Carolina's 2023 IRP reference build plan filed in docket number 2023-9E and approved by this commission, and then Santee Cooper's 2023 IRP's preferred portfolio, which was filed in docket number 2023-154E. Would you agree with me that the amount of solar on the system in the Duke plan in 2038 at the end of the base planning period is relatively comparable to the other peer utilities that you identify?
As a megawatt percentage, it's comparable.
Okay, and it's a little less than Dominion at 41% and a little more than Santee at 29%, recognizing that they're different size systems. So in terms of megawatts, it will be different. But as a breakdown of the capacity on the system, the relative trajectory and pace is comparable.
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously differences between all three of these utilities. There are differences in the other resources that make up those portfolios. And again, this chart and kind of the point of my testimony was to contextualize what Duke was doing as compared to peer utilities. It wasn't a critique. It was an illustration of where these trends are today around us and around the country. And so, whether Duke's at, higher or lower than Dominion wasn't the point. It was more to show that these trends are consistent and the overall volumes are, in the same ballpark.
Okay.
I mean, whether comparable is the right word or not. I mean, you've got, 41% versus 29%, like, if Duke were doing, so.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
And maybe part of the reason is it fair to say that it may not be apples to apples comparable precisely is because there's other resources in the Duke plan, whether that's the increased nuclear capacity at 16% or pump storage hydro that is providing capacity to the system on the Duke as part of the Duke plan that's not represented as part of the Dominion plan.
Yeah, there are other details that certainly matter, and this commission will be considering during its review of the IRP.
Okay, but directionally consistent amongst the three utilities.
Yeah, I think directionally the consistency directionally was more the point of my testimony. Yeah.
Okay. All right, Mr. Haggerty, a few questions for you, please, sir. You were retained by CCBA as a technical expert in this proceeding, correct?
That's correct.
All right, and so in your work at Brattle, you have expertise in utility and electric power industry planning, regulatory analysis, utility resource planning, transmission planning, etc. It didn't say specifically that you are an expert or have expertise or experience in modeling. Is that an area of your work that you have experience in production cost and capacity expansion modeling?
It is. Yeah, yes, that is a part of what we do when we support and do that type of work that I explained in the testimony. Modeling is a component of that.
Okay, but you didn't prepare any modeling in this proceeding, correct?
That's right. I did not prepare any modeling.
And did you have an opportunity to review Duke's work papers and supporting modeling files which were produced when the companies filed their initial plan?
Partially. I didn't go through it as thoroughly as I would have if I had done my own modeling and was trying to put forward a different set of portfolios. but various aspects, much of which I covered in my testimony, is what I reviewed.
Okay, but you didn't take a comprehensive view, let's say, in terms of fully analyzing an alternative portfolio and presenting that to the commission in this proceeding?
That's right.
Okay, and actually, no party has presented alternative portfolios in this proceeding, isn't that correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay. Can you please turn to pages 14 and 15 of your testimony?
Yes.
All right. So I want to, you have a confidential figure 4, which I want to discuss briefly, but I don't want to get into the confidential information. So the purpose of this figure and analysis, as I understand it, was to quantify the relative risks of P3 fall base as compared to a portfolio that did not have a price or any carbon assumption in the planning, such as the P0 portfolio. Is that accurate?
Yes, it was to compare certain aspects of those different portfolios.
Okay. And without getting any confidential information, and I think I used the phrase directionally with Mr. Davis, so maybe you can directionally explain what this analysis shows without getting into the confidential information.
Certainly. So this analysis directionally shows the differences in exposure to higher natural gas prices. We saw in Duke's analysis of its P3 fall base portfolios that it had done a sensitivity of high gas prices versus the reference gas prices and the lower gas prices. We did not see a similar sensitivity of the no carbon constraints. We did see that directionally that portfolio, the no carbon constraints portfolio, included a significant higher amount of capacity of gas and as well as total consumption of natural gas, which would expose customers within the Duke territories to the risks of higher natural gas prices. So without having that sensitivity from Duke's own analysis, I estimated the additional costs that Duke ratepayers would be exposed to due to if they were to adopt the no carbon constraints portfolio.
Okay.
I believe that answers your question.
It does. And this analysis was prepared in advance of the Clean Air Act 111 final rule being completed and didn't factor in that additional impact. Is that accurate?
It did not factor in the impact of that rule.
Okay. Would you believe that compliance with Clean Air Act 111 final rule would have more significant impacts on a portfolio that doesn't plan for carbon risk than one such as P3 fall base that does take that into account in the planning assumptions that are used?
Yes, to make sure I got your question right, my understanding is you're asking if the no carbon constraints portfolio would be impacted more by that regulation than the P3 fall base, correct?
That's correct, because it's
Yeah.
assuming it's using more gas and more turbines emitting or producing less generation, so they're consuming more
Right.
gas.
Yes, I have not looked at the exact output of the gas resources in each of these portfolios because that is one of the aspects of the EPA's rule is that it limit the output. But I would assume that the output of the case with more gas that would be utilized more frequently than a portfolio with less gas.
Okay, and would you suggest that that final rule now supports planning for operational limits on carbon emitting generation, and that's something that should be taken into account when you're planning an IRP?
Yes, yep, and that is one of the my points in the one of my final points related to compliance with state and federal environmental regulations. That exact point, that the portfolio that includes less gas and more non-gas resources would be better prepared to comply with that regulation.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you very much. Sierra Club, any questions?
No questions, thank you.
CCL SACE,
No questions.
thank you. Walmart,
No questions, thank you.
Commissioners.
No question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Now, Commissioner, any questions? Commissioner Williams.
Thank you, Chair Powers. Good afternoon. Good to see you all.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
I'm going to start with my questions that I think are more for Mr. Davis, but as you testified, I could see where both of you may have input. You know what? I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to start with a real easy question for you, Mr. Haggerty.
Excellent.
Page 40 of your testimony. Would you read that top sentence to yourself and see if it might be missing a word?
This is the sentence that starts with proactive multi-value.
Yeah, actually, it's the second sentence.
Okay. Yes, that's correct. I can see that there's a missing word there. And the sentence reads, transmission capacity can increase access to a broader set of, and there's a missing word there, and that should say resources. Broader set of resources than otherwise would be available, especially during challenging market conditions such as heat waves and cold snaps. Thank you for catching that.
Sure, I knew it would be easy. There's been conversation this morning about, or today, about virtual power plants and industrial batteries. And what do you think the opportunity is there for battery paired solar, paired with solar and CPREs? It's more of a generic, general question.
Do you mean customer sided or like with a
No,
VPP?
I mean, what for folks that could participate in a CPRE or, you know.
So you're talking about like virtual power
Right,
plant
I am.
competing in CPREs?
Yes.
Mike, you may have a better idea of.
Yeah, well, not specific to the CPRE.
Okay.
But some of my colleagues, not specifically myself, have done significant analysis of virtual power plants and have found that there's certainly an opportunity for virtual power plants to be considered as a least cost resource. I don't believe there's been a specific analysis done in Duke's territory in South Carolina, but some of the benefits of virtual power plants at on site would be increased reliability benefits because that resource is directly on site. There's no transmission or distribution wires between the resource and load. It also could avoid some of the challenges that we've seen in interconnection by installing that behind the meter. Whereas a lot of other resources that interconnect to the wholesale system must go through the interconnection process that has had delays recently. Some of those have been improved through the cluster study process that Duke has taken advantage of here. But that is often seen as a benefit of virtual power plants, to kind of speak generally, or virtual power plants.
Do either of you have anything to add to the conversation that we've had so far regarding the obligation of the company to serve?
Could you be more specific?
Just thinking about the economic development, thinking about residential development, there's been some language used that I'm just seeking for more clarity in terms of if that development happens and the company is not able to provide the capacity that's needed, what is your understanding of their circumstance? And I know this is kind of out of left field for you all, but I also am interested in hearing somebody more independent answer that.
So I had this conversation with the Senate committee last week, actually in Columbia. So I'm not a rate expert, and I don't want to get over my skis here, but I would just say that generally what you're not going to see is customers interconnecting to the system and creating reliability problems for other customers. That there's an orderly process by which a customer interconnects, and the utility ensures they have the resources available to serve them. And to the extent that there are, unusual or extraordinary additional investments that are required to serve those customers, then often those are paid for by those customers. So, I think in the context of this economic development, load growth conversation we're having as a state, a lot of this is the prerogative of policymakers in terms of recognizing that as they go out and recruit large new employers, large new loads, that comes with obligations on the electric system as well. And which was the purpose of that conversation, was policymakers need to be aware of that and think about that and make sure that our statutes in South Carolina are accommodating and reflecting their prerogative as policymakers in the state. So I don't think I'll stop there.
Yeah, I would say that's the value of a planning process such as this, and why you want to have an open mind to what the future could hold when you do that type of planning and look at a range of conditions in the future market, both for planning generation and storage resources as well as transmission. Too often, some of those studies look too narrowly at a single most expected case, and don't really think broadly about higher load overall due to development, but also worst case scenarios, cold snaps, heat waves. So given the amount of load growth that we are seeing, it certainly is a time to utilize as many of the techniques and resources that are available to the utility to ensure that they are prepared for that, and then go through the orderly process, just like they do on the generation side, which Hamilton's very familiar with, but also on the load side to ensure that they can serve those customers.
Do either of you have anything to offer in terms of the conversation about transmission planning and its importance in above and beyond what's already what already takes place within the IRPs?
Certainly. Duke has, as I detailed in aspects of my testimony, that Duke has taken on and implemented a new transmission planning process. It has already started to do so through the multi-value strategic transmission planning process. That is, they're a member of the Carolinas Transmission Planning Collaborative. I think that's a very important process, and they're going through it the first time this year. I definitely commend them for moving forward with that. That's something that they pursued over the last 2 years and received approval from FERC. But I would definitely stress that having seen a lot of these transmission planning studies over my last 11 years at the Broward Group, these types of studies can be done well and they can be done poorly. So just the fact that they have a tariff that says that they will do certain steps doesn't necessarily mean that it will be done well. So I think it's important. I know through the MBST that I'm seeing steps in that direction. Already they have proposed to model 3 different scenarios with alternative resource portfolios, and as well as sensitivities around load growth, to your previous point. And so that's a good start. They've also proposed looking beyond what's just a simple view of the benefits of transmission, but multiple benefits, several of which that were included in the recent FERC order number 1920 for regional planning. So we're seeing steps in the right direction, but as I supported CCBA and other stakeholders in comments to MVST, highlighting some additional steps that they need to take, places where maybe they're not going to be as effective in the implementation of that process as based on my experience, think they could be. One aspect of that we've been really highlighting is that they need to model their system on a very granular basis in order to understand the benefits of transmission upgrades. So far, they've proposed to just do that on a zonal basis, which will get some of the transmission constraints, but not specific, the more granular line-by-line details. So that's something that I would recommend that the commission stay on top of, keep track of, and ask Duke whether they're following industry best practices in the implementation of that process.
I would just, add on to the end of this, to Mike's answer. I think moving forward, this integration of transmission and generation planning is just going to be absolutely necessary if we're going to respond to the types of challenges and opportunities that are out there. Duke has started going down that path, and we've certainly been supportive of the direction that they're headed and have participated in that process. But I think you are seeing this around the country begin to pick up steam. Some places are further ahead of us, but I suspect our legislature will be speaking to this, and I think that generally as a region, there's a heightened need to marry that generation and transmission planning in a way that there's a comprehensive picture of what's required to serve these new loads and serve them with the resources that they expect to be online.
And when you refer to opportunities that are kind of emerging, can you give a little bit more detail to that?
I mean, just primarily it's the fact that our state is aggressively pursuing new large employers to come to the state, and that's the opportunity on the economic side. It's also these different resources have different economic impacts on the state in terms of what they mean for local investment. So with resources like solar, looking at Dominion, Santee, Duke IRPs, to the extent those IRPs are executed on, you'll see somewhere in the range of $19 billion of in-state economic activity around that development. So you've got economic development in the form of these large employers, and then you're also driving economic development in how you're serving those employers.
Yeah, in relation to the load growth, one of the reasons that proactive transmission planning is so important is that Duke would be building out its system in anticipation of additional resources added to the system. Additional resources will be needed as the resource mix transitions, but also with the growth of the demand on the system. Currently, up till now, prior to the MVST, there's been no analysis and study of future needs of the transmission system for new generation resources. That only comes out through the generator interconnection process. To the extent that upgrades are needed and significant upgrades are expected to be needed, the process of identifying those upgrades and building them only occurs once that request has been submitted. And that delays the ability to bring those resources onto the system, because then they must both build the generation resource as well as the transmission. To the extent that, especially if those transmission upgrades can take much longer to build than the generation resource, a proactive transmission planning process can identify not all of the upgrades, but the major upgrades that are often referred to as highways or trunk projects, backbone projects, into the regions of the Carolinas that have the most desirable locations for solar. So once you build those, instead of building those once developers like Hamilton and his colleagues come to Duke with projects, and then they start building and identifying those. If you know that you're going to be transitioning the system to these new resources, getting ahead of that and building the common facilities that will be needed for a much larger amount of capacity than just a single project at a time.
Mr. Haggerty, at the bottom of the second page of your summary to us, you talk some about the Duke's P3 fall-based portfolio. I'm now at the top of page 3.
Sure.
Would cost less than Duke assumed in its Encompass simulations.
Sorry, just getting over to the summary here. Oh, there it is. Apologize.
And that's okay. I'm going to ask a stupid question, but is that all transmission related? And what yeah.
Yes, just to clarify, in their IRP modeling, for each of the resources that could be built, they include the capital cost, operating costs of those generation resources. But they also add on an estimate of the cost of the transmission that's needed to build, to interconnect to those resources. In the modeling, they used assumptions, and I can find the exact numbers here. They were in the, I believe, 20 to 30 cents per watt range. And sorry, I'm trying not to take too much time. 1 second.
That's okay. I might go ahead and tell you where I was headed, and then you
Okay.
can tell me whether it's apples to oranges, because earlier today, Commissioner Caston was talking with, I think, Witness Salter, but about the table 45 in the ORS report. And I think that this is about, and it looks at the percentage increase cost to customer, and it compares the various portfolios.
Okay.
And all I'm really asking is whether what you're talking about is a drill down nuance within this impact to customer, because here you're saying this is it's going to cost less than Duke estimated.
That's right.
Yes,
that's right.
So my question, I guess, is, are these apples to oranges? Is this a subset of the other?
Yeah, so Duke included in its analysis cost of transmission with all of the solar additions. And this study from the CTPC actually identified that cost would be lower than Duke had assumed in its resource portfolios. So proactive planning such as that's shown through the public policy study that actually included much more, included about the same as P3 fall base. If those upgrades were to be built relative to the cost that we've seen through the piecemeal one project at a time or cluster at a time, that would reduce the costs. This is demonstrating, I think the point here is demonstrating that proactive planning can reduce the costs of achieving these portfolios. And to the extent that you were reviewing costs across different portfolios, proactive planning would reduce those costs.
And would that number have been provided to Kennedy when they produced the study for ORS? Or is this a newer addition?
This was a study that was completed this past spring.
Okay, 2024.
Yes, it started last year, so it was the 2023 study, but it was released, I believe, in May.
Okay.
And the point here was really just to show that there's benefits to proactive planning, and also that they should use that information the next time that they do similar studies to better reflect the costs of solar, and showing that their analysis this past time was a bit on the high side.
Thank you. I could have other questions, but I'd be happy to yield to anybody else. But if there's not anybody else, I will keep looking at my notes.
First, Commissioner Williams, let me add the correction by Witness Haggerty from your question about the missing word of resources is on page 30 at line 3, and we would make that a part of your pre-filed direct testimony.
Thank you.
Any other commissioner questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We were going to make that suggestion, but we appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, page 40, line 3. Any other commissioner questions?
Mr. Davis, based on your testimony, are you saying that portfolio P3 fall is the most reasonable and prudent from your assessment of the circumstances we're in?
I think from the perspective of the coal retirements and the solar and storage additions, those are consistent with what you would expect to see in a most reasonable and prudent plan. I think looking at the balancing factors, those are necessary to meet them. I certainly didn't conduct any type of overall analysis, and I'm not speaking to some of the other resources that are outside of my range of expertise.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it from both of you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Caston.
Mr. Haggerty, I guess that similar question that Commissioner Williams asked just now relative to the preferred portfolio P3. I didn't see in your testimony specifically where you said one way or the other, but
Yeah, similar to Hamilton, I did not, or Mr. Davis, I did not do my own modeling or analysis of the comparative benefits and costs, or pros and cons. But to the extent the solar and storage assumptions, I think do align with the balancing test in South Carolina. But I don't have a particular view on P3 fall base versus other portfolios.
all right. Thank you both, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Whitt, any redirect?
No redirect, but thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony, and you may step down.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you.
Thank you.
ORS.
Chair Powers, Office of Regulatory Staff called Mr. Phil Hyatt to the stand.
Is Mr. Hyatt virtual?
I am.
Chair Powers, excuse me, sorry. I don't think that we requested that our witnesses be excused, but they don't have any additional testimony. We'd ask that they be excused.
They're excused.
I'm sorry for the interruption.
No problem. Mr. Hyatt, can you hear me okay?
I can.
All right, would you please raise your right hand? Do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Your witness.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hyatt.
Good afternoon.
Would you please state your name and business address for the business address and occupation for the record?
My name is Philip Hayett, and I'm a Vice President and Principal of J. Kennedy & Associates. My business address is 570 Colonial Park Drive, Suite 305, Roswell, Georgia 30075.
And Mr. Hayett, in response to Commissioner Thomas' question earlier in this proceeding, will you be appearing before the commission again for your rebuttal testimony?
I will.
Are you the same Philip Hayett who prepared a cause to be prepared 19 pages of pre-filed direct testimony in this docket on July 1st, 2024?
I am.
Do you have any changes, edits, or corrections to your pre-filed testimony?
I don't.
If I were to ask you the same questions as those posed in your pre-filed testimony, would your answers be the same?
They would.
Chair Powers, ORS asks that Mr. Hayett's pre-filed direct testimony be read into the record as if given orally from the stand.
The pre-filed direct testimony of Mr. Hayett will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
And Mr. Hayett, did you pre-file with your direct testimony one exhibit marked as Exhibit PMH-1?
I did.
Do you have any changes or edits or corrections to your pre-file exhibit?
I do not.
Chair Powers, I ask that Mr. Hayes' exhibit PMH-1 be marked for identification and entered into the record as the next hearing exhibit.
The pre-file exhibit witness head identified as PMH-1 is marked for identification and will be placed in the record as exhibit number 22.
Thank you. And Mr. Hayes, did you prepare a summary of your pre-file direct testimony?
I did.
Please present it at this time.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. The purpose of my direct testimony was to describe Kennedy's review of Duke Energy's 2023 IRP, which included an assessment of Duke Energy's compliance with statutory and regulatory requirements. My team assisted in the preparation of the ORS report regarding Duke Energy's 2023 IRP. We worked closely with witness Finley Salter and others at ORS in developing the report, which was attached as a corrected exhibit JFS-1 to witness Salter's direct testimony. The ORS report identified two statutory compliance issues. I addressed a reliability issue related to section 583740B1G, and ORS witness Salter addressed a transmission reporting issue related to section 583740B1D. In addition, the ORS report identified 9 compliance issues associated with prior commission orders. ORS's report included 19 recommendations which addressed all of the compliance issues and other issues as well. After considering Duke Energy's rebuttal testimony, ORS discussed its final positions on the recommendations in its rebuttal testimony. Of the 19 recommendations, I addressed 10, ORS witness Wellborn addressed 8, and ORS witness Salter addressed 1 recommendation. In this summary of my direct testimony, I focus on the 10 recommendations I addressed. For the sake of the summary, I preview the fact that ORS considers that 4 of the recommendations are resolved, 2 are resolved with clarification, and 4 are unresolved. My summary discussion is organized by these categories. However, I will discuss the resolution of these 10 recommendations when I present my rebuttal summary. I begin with the 4 items that have been resolved. Recommendation 1 proposed Duke Energy discuss requirements that were not fully complied with from prior commission orders. In addition, Recommendation 1 proposed Duke Energy seek relief from the Commission whenever it intends to modify assumptions and methodologies that were previously required by the Commission. The first compliance item was a Commission requirement for Duke to use specific National Renewable Energy Lab annual technology baseline low cost, which was considered the advanced case, data in IRPs. Duke Energy found the NREL ATB low costs were too low to use in base case analyses, but it did use them in a sensitivity case. The second item related to a natural gas forecasting approach Duke Energy was required to use, and the blending from a market to a fundamental-based forecast. Duke Energy relied on its own forecasting approach for most cases, but it used the Commission-required approach in a sensitivity case. A third compliance item related to modeling portfolios of high and low EE and DSM cases across a range of fuel and CO2 assumptions. Duke Energy developed bookend cases to evaluate different combinations of fuel, CO2, and EE assumptions. Again, in my rebuttal summary, I will discuss the resolutions of those issues. The recommendation F1 related to ORS's concern that Duke Energy's wind and SMR resources have not yet proven to be commercially viable in the Carolinas. Though Duke Energy developed a preferred portfolio heavily dependent on those with plans to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on development costs in the near term. ORS recommended Duke Energy explain in rebuttal testimony the impacts on its preferred portfolio if those resources prove to be less feasible than expected or more expensive than current projections. Recommendation F3 related to ORS's concern that certain future resources appear to be treated the same as existing resources in the company's production cost modeling, and ORS sought additional information about these resources on an ongoing basis so that in the future they could be inspected more transparently. Recommendation F6 related to Duke Energy's Bat Creek 2 pump storage expansion economic analysis. ORS reviewed Duke Energy's modeling and sought additional analysis to ensure the results were not biased. All right, so the next set are items that are considered to be resolved with clarification. The first item is recommendation A1, related to ORS's concern that Duke Energy failed to address the requirement of meeting current and future capacity needs as required by South Carolina Code 583740 B1G. Based on the 2023 Resource Adequacy Study Astropi performed, Duke Energy concluded the combined system would require a 22% winter planning reserve margin target. However, between 2024 and 2030, Duke Energy's preferred plan calls for a lower winter planning reserve margin target ranging from just a lower winter planning reserve margin ranging from just 18.5% to 21.4% during that period. ORS recommended Duke Energy provide an explanation of all reasonable and prudent steps it could take to mitigate reliability risks in that period. Recommendation F7 also relates to the Bad Creek project. ORS recommended Duke provide ongoing construction project status reports in future IRP and IRP updates, and proposed an updated economic analysis be performed if the projected costs are expected to exceed the current estimate by more than 15%. Duke Energy agreed, but stated it would provide status reports only when costs exceeded 15% above the installed project cost. Finally, I discussed the 4 items that remain unresolved. Recommendation F2 proposed that in the 2025 IRP update, Duke Energy evaluate optimal retirement dates for the Blues Creek and Mayo 1 units without the requirement that all coal units must retire by 2036. ORS views Duke Energy's 2036 retirement date decision to be arbitrary. The Clean Air Act Section 111 final rule allows coal units with gas co-firing to continue to operate until 2039, which Blues Creek is capable of doing. ORS recommends optimal retirement dates should be addressed in the next IRP update. Recommendation F4 proposed Duke Energy continue to perform minimax regret analyses and include CO2 price risk as a key variable in future IRP and IRP updates. Recommendation F5 initially requested Duke Energy develop an additional portfolio as an alternative to portfolio SPA P3 fall base, created consistent with the way Duke Energy and other South Carolina utilities have created portfolios in previous IRP analyses. This recommendation sought a case that accounted for CO2 cost risk, but would not be constrained to meet a 70% reduction in CO2 emissions by an arbitrary year such as 2035. Finally, recommendation F8 proposed Duke Energy take all reasonable and prudent measures following the 2023 IRP to identify ultimate generation resources to support its load forecast beyond 2030. These steps may include, but are not limited to, conducting an all-source RFP to acquire additional long-term capacity resources. ORS considers an all-source RFP to be a best practice in the utility industry. The companies plan to acquire resources beyond 2030. For example, the company's plan calls for a CC resource to be added in 2032, sited in South Carolina. It would be reasonable to conduct an all-source RFP for resources within service dates beyond 2030, as time constraints should not be a factor. Furthermore, by conducting RFPs, utilities gain valuable insight that can then inform costs and other inputs that can be fed back into the modeling performed in IRPs. This concludes my summary.
Thank you, Mr. Hayett. Chair Powers, Mr. Hayett is available for questions from the parties and the commission.
Thank you, Ms. Rainey. Duke Energy, any questions?
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hayett.
Good afternoon.
Brett Braceward on behalf of Duke Energy. How are you today?
I'm good. I could see you talking, but I couldn't hear you.
That's all right. I've done this 3 times now, and I just missed the button. So, all right. Couple of questions for you, sir. So you are the lead consultant for J. Kennedy Associates, who was the primary drafter of the ORS report, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. And this is your second.
I would say I was the lead consultant. It was a team effort to draft the report.
Understood. And on page 3 of your testimony, you say you have overall responsibility for managing the work Kennedy performed. So that's really what I was trying to establish. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Thank you. And were you here earlier in the day when Mr. Welborn was asking Mr. Salter some questions about how ORS approached its evaluation of the Duke IRP? Did you hear that testimony? And he asked him some questions about whether ORS considered the public interest in its evaluation of the IRP, understanding that ORS represents the public interest in proceedings before the commission. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes.
And do you have any comments on J. Kennedy's approach and whether you took into account a public interest lens in your review of the IRP?
I think I would answer similar to Mr. Salter. I think that what we did is we considered whether or not that Duke Energy's IRP complied with prior commission orders as well as the statute. That was an important aspect of it. I am sure that we attempt to balance interest, if that's what you're trying to get at.
Yeah.
In our consideration.
Thank you. That's helpful. And did you review the South Carolina chapter of the company's plan?
Yes.
And are you familiar that the company analyzed the resource plan as well as the recommended portfolio and near-term actions in the context of South Carolina law beyond the IRP statute?
I believe that's what Duke has stated in the report, in the IRP report section that you're referring to.
Thank you. And did you take into account or consider other South Carolina policies such as Act 220 or Executive Order 2023-18 as referenced in the South Carolina chapter in your assessment of the company's IRP generally?
I can't say that we conducted any specific analysis reviewing those orders or statutes, but truthfully, that's a policy consideration that I think that Mr. Salter would have taken into consideration.
That's fair enough. So would you say in your review you didn't go beyond the technical in evaluating the most reasonable and prudent plan for the companies in South Carolina?
Other than discussions that we would have had, I would say that we primarily focused on technical, but there were plenty of discussions that we had on policy matters.
Okay, thank you. And when was J. Kennedy Associates retained by ORS to review the 23 IRP?
I would say a few months before it was filed.
Okay. And I spoke with Ms. Welburner earlier, and she said that she did not participate in any of the company's pre-filing stakeholder engagement working group sessions, but did you participate in any of those sessions?
No.
Did you have a chance to review Appendix A to the company's resource plan, which provided an overview of the stakeholder work that was done in advance of filing the IRP?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to refer you to page 2 of that appendix if you can see the Elmo here in the room.
I have to get close.
Let's see if I can.
A little blurry.
That clear enough there?
Yeah.
Okay. So the company, as this timeline and topics highlights, had 5 stakeholder engagement sessions that span from February of 2023 through June of 2023. Were you aware that that stakeholder engagement was ongoing at the time?
Yes.
Okay. And the topics that the company addressed were designed, would you agree, to highlight some of the key issues that were raised and in controversy in the 2020 IRP proceeding here in South Carolina, and to address topics that were in the Commission's 2020 IRP order?
Yes.
Okay. And just more generally, does this look like an appropriate scope of topics for stakeholder engagement based on your experience with integrated resource plans?
Could you make it bigger?
I will take one more shot at that. Is that better?
Yeah. Load forecast is the first one, the solar, load carrying capability, natural gas, coal retirement, resource adequacy, key modeling assumptions.
Correct. And some of the things that you highlighted in your recommendations in this proceeding were topics that the company addressed through stakeholder engagement, such as assumptions around solar modeling, and then natural gas price forecast, and then the resource adequacy study and approach. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And then the summary of key modeling assumptions, the analytical framework. That was a discussion of the portfolios and the analytical framework the companies were planning to present in this 2023 IRP. That was meeting 5 that happened in June. See that?
Right, shortly before the filing, a few months before the filing was made.
That's right. And then I'll refer you to the highlighted language at the bottom of the page. And were you aware that the company's as part of this dual state planning for the IRP and stakeholder engagement, also engaged in South Carolina specific breakout sections in the stakeholder process?
I think I was aware of that.
Okay. Is that unique in your experience? Are you aware of other utilities that have undertaken targeted breakout sessions to ensure stakeholders from one jurisdiction are heard and their feedback can be incorporated into the resource plan?
Yes, I've heard of that.
You are aware of other utilities undertaking a similar approach?
Yes.
Okay, which utilities would that be?
Pacific Corp.
Okay, thank you. All right. Want to move on to page 4 of your testimony, please. At line 8, in terms of what you evaluated, you evaluated alternative resource plans. That just want to confirm when you're saying that these are alternative portfolios that were prepared by Duke as part of their IRP. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And are you aware that the IRP statute here in South Carolina provides that intervening parties like the Office of Regulatory Staff can also provide alternative plans for consideration by the Commission?
I'm generally aware that the ORS could do that, yes.
And it's specifically called out in section C1 of the statute. Are you aware of that?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you. And looking at your professional qualifications back on page 1, your testimony suggests that you have an extensive background in IRP planning and experience with capacity expansion and production cost modeling. Is that accurate?
That's accurate.
Okay. And is it accurate that others at J. Kennedy Associates also have extensive experience with production cost modeling?
Yes.
Okay. And do you perform capacity expansion and production cost modeling for other utility clients?
Yes.
And do you have prior experience either providing modeling service or analyzing the operations of other utilities with dual state operations like the Duke companies?
Yes.
And did you discuss with ORS whether to perform independent modeling to present an alternative resource plan to Duke's proposed plan?
Yes, I'd say we discussed that, yes.
Okay. And are you aware that Duke provided all of their modeling work papers back on August 17th of last year when they submitted the plan so that ORS, other intervening parties, would have access to those modeling files, and if they elected to do so, they could present their own alternative portfolio or modeling analysis?
Yes.
And over the last year and a half, ORS never directed J. Kennedy Associates to perform any modeling in this proceeding. Is that accurate?
We conducted evaluations. We reviewed the models. We actually ran the models. We validated the models. We reproduced the results that the company made. We even conducted, at times our own investigations of runs. We did not put forth an alternative resource plan. That was for the company to do. In this case, it's historically we have not, the ORS has not had us do that in IRP cases. So that was something that we were not, that we did not do in this case.
Okay. And Mr. Welborn had some questions for Mr. Salter about the scope of services for J. Kennedy, and was modeling part of that scope of services? Is that something that you could have or were capable of doing under the terms of that agreement?
Essentially, the agreement said that the ORS may ask you to do a number of things from the scope of services. And
Okay.
so that is one of the items that could have been performed in this analysis. That's not to say that they wouldn't ask in the future, but in the past, that has been something that we haven't put forth our own alternative plan.
Okay.
That's for the company. The company, the ORS to date has felt that's been the company's statutory requirement.
The statutory requirement of the company to establish the portfolios for the commission to consider.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn now to discuss a little bit.
And if I can add to my response, ORS did ask for, on 2 occasions, the company to do modeling per specifications that ORS requested.
Correct.
And the company did not on one, and it did on the other.
That's correct. And we also prepared modeling. I think I spoke with Ms. Welburn earlier in response to her request or recommendation related to EPA 111 Clean Air Act analysis.
That's correct.
Thank you.
That's correct.
Okay. Want to turn to focus on the company's dual state operations. Would you agree that Duke's dual state operations are unique amongst utilities in South Carolina?
I would say they're unique amongst utilities in South Carolina. They're not necessarily unique across the country.
Fair enough. Did you take that into account in your investigation into the IRP, that the company's planning and operating a system across a dual state service territory or balancing authority areas?
Well, I would say that that was something that Duke covered as part of the IRP, and it's something that we discussed during the course of the IRP. So if that's taking into consideration, I think I would say the answer is yes.
Okay, thank you. Part of the dual state operations and the design and operation of the company system is the joint dispatch agreement between the 2 operating companies. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And that allows DEC and DEP to economically transfer non-firm energy between the 2 utilities?
Yes.
Okay. And then, as discussed in the plan, this may have been what you were referring to earlier, Duke took a consolidated system operations approach to planning in this IRP?
Yes.
And so just to confirm, I hesitate to put this in if it's going to be too difficult to read. Is that legible for you?
It's not appearing.
Someone will work the magic, I expect.
Okay.
Excellent. And so the companies, in preparing the plan, took a consolidated system operations approach to modeling their 2 systems. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
And this is from Chapter 2 of the plan at page 17. You probably can't see the page number there. But would you agree with me that the consolidated system operations approach required each utility to independently plan their generation to meet capacity needs and their planning reserve margin, but allowed the model to use a consolidated approach to dispatching the system and meeting operating reserve requirements?
Yes, that's not unusual for a dual system such as Duke.
Okay, and just for my education, what other dual state utilities are you referring to that's not uncommon, or based on your
Southern
experience?
Company, Entergy, Pacificorp.
Which Southern Company utilities plan across or have balancing authorities extending across state lines?
Well, I thought you were talking about planning for a consolidated system. I thought that was the point you were trying to make, and it's not unusual for a utility that operates across multi-states that have utilities in multiple states to plan for the consolidated system.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And so they have to ultimately plan and execute on a single plan. They have to establish what capacity they're going to build and what resources they're going to plan to retire on a singular basis, even if it's across multiple jurisdictions. Is that fair?
Well, that assumes that they don't have specific requirements in different states that they have to meet.
Can you give me a for example?
For example, in Pacificorp, they have to meet requirements in Oregon separate from other states, and they have to meet requirements in Washington separate from other states that are part of the Pacificorp, 6-state system.
But they ultimately have to plan generation and construct new resources and retire resources to meet their planning reserve margin and their reliability obligations, correct?
Of course.
Right. And so they're ultimately planning maybe to meet different requirements in different states, but they're planning to operate a single system. The guy in the control room is looking at a single set of resources, even if they're planned to meet the needs and the policy expectations of different jurisdictions. Is that fair?
Well, now that's a question about operation, and the answer is yes. The guy in the control room is operating the resources that are available to the system in a least cost economic dispatch. So, yes.
Okay, thank you. And in analyzing the company's IRP, did you or the ORS consider what the IRP would look like if not planning for the dual state system?
No, we didn't consider that because we do expect Duke to plan economically for the system.
Okay, to pull the thread on that a little bit, would you agree that planning for the dual state system across the Carolinas is a more economical approach than segregating out South Carolina's load and planning for that on a single state basis?
It is, and of course you always have to consider constraints when you do your planning. And the question becomes, what constraints are you planning to? If you have no constraints, then obviously it's a cheaper result. It's a more cost-effective result. If you introduce constraints, that leads to less economic result. So the answer is, when you plan meeting your constraints, the result is more economic if you plan on a consolidated basis. The question is, what constraints are you planning towards?
Thank you. And looking at it from another lens, would you agree that there's other benefits such as the flexibility to site generation in optimal locations, such as the 6 nuclear plants that are sited here in South Carolina?
As a benefit of dual system planning?
As a benefit, yeah, as a benefit to dual system planning.
The fact that 6 nuclear units are sited in South Carolina? I'm not following your question. I'm not trying to be difficult because it might be a yes, but I'm
understood. Let me try it a different way.
What I'm saying yes to.
If the Duke companies were planning on a single state basis for South Carolina, there would be no reason to cite 6 nuclear plants in South Carolina. Would you agree with that? That amount of capacity would exceed. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I don't know. I'd have to do the analysis of why 6 nuclear units got cited. That was outside of the scope of what we worked on for this project. But you're trying to get at the notion of, if you plan for 2 systems with no constraints, would it be more economic than if you plan for just a single state with those with no constraints? Yeah, I would say that it would be more economic to plan on a 2-state basis.
Thank you. And you would agree there's benefits to the counties and communities where those plants are located in terms of tax base, jobs, and benefits to the local community and region?
Of course.
Thank you. And I think we established this earlier, but would you agree there are also operational efficiencies and cost savings of planning for the larger dual state systems, such as in fuel efficiencies of purchasing fuel and economies of scale?
Yes.
All right. Want to talk briefly about the Commission's order in the 2020 IRP proceeding. You were a witness in that proceeding, correct?
Yes.
And it was the first proceeding for the Duke companies on under Act 62. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And so this was the first time the Commission evaluated what its obligations were under Act 62, and the company is the first time they presented a plan under Act 62?
Yeah.
All right. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to take judicial notice of order number 2021-447, which was the Commission's order in the 2020 IRP proceeding pursuant to Regulation 103-846C, which provides the commission authority to take judicial notice of commission
Notice
orders.
is taken.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Hayett, and I don't know if it would be helpful to the commission, but I did provide copies. It doesn't need to be a hearing exhibit, but I've got copies of excerpts if that would be helpful. So, Mr. Hayett, if you recall, would you agree that one of the contested issues in that initial IRP proceeding was whether the utility was required to recommend or select a preferred portfolio for consideration by the commission?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm hopeful this will make it onto the screen shortly, but I'll go ahead and read it to you. I've got a couple things I want to explore with you. So, based on your familiarity with this proceeding, which was the first under Act 62, would you agree with me that the commission determined in this initial IRP proceeding that Act 62 empowers the commission with the authority to approve the utility's IRP if it's the most reasonable and prudent means of meeting the utility's energy and capacity needs at the time of review? That was generally what the statute says, but significantly they said this was a new development under Act 62. Is that correct?
Yes.
And they also said that selecting a single resource plan or portfolio is an implied step. It's a necessary step in getting to that most reasonable and prudent plan.
That's correct.
Okay. And in terms of evaluating the company's resource plan, one of the things that the commission recognized is that over time, both short-term and long-term, the company's going to make a variety of resource decisions. They could change over time, but those necessarily need to be reflected within the preferred portfolio presented by the companies. You agree with that?
Yes.
And I think Mr. Welborn went through this earlier with Mr. Hayett, but those the resources identified in the short term and in the long term, which may adjust, are then used as inputs for other proceedings in South Carolina.
That's correct.
And that could be a certificate proceeding. It could be an avoided cost proceeding. It could be the inputs and assumptions for demand side management. So getting that portfolio right and the most reasonable and prudent plan was a necessary step. You agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. And so I think that's what the commission concluded, is that the utilities plan must indicate which preferred portfolio it intends to pursue. And the commission, I think we heard from Mr. Salter earlier that the commission in the initial Dominion order highlighted the importance of a short-term action plan as being a necessary requirement. Do you recall that?
I recall that.
Okay. But would you also accept that the commission in the 2020 Duke IRP order also was very clear that the utility must both identify a preferred portfolio out of the portfolios analyzed and include a short-term action plan that identifies the steps the utility will take to achieve that preferred portfolio?
Yes, I recall those.
Okay, and so that's consistent with the near-term action approach the company has presented to the commission in this proceeding. You agree with that?
Yes, I would.
Okay, thank you. All right, do you have your report with you, sir?
Yes.
All right, could you turn to pages 9 and 10, please?
I have that.
Thank you. All right, so on page 9 of your report here, this is where you're introducing the report and discussing at this juncture the near-term actions. You block in a quote by Miss Heather Shirley Smith, or witness Shirley Smith, for her direct testimony. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And the first line of that quote says, while the IRP or the company's IRP is a long-term planning document identifying resource needs for the next 15 years, it is imperative to take actions in the near term to ensure adequate and reliable capacity. And then you reference the NTAP as, or I guess this is her testimony referencing the NTAP as shown in this South Carolina chapter supplement that I've spoken with a number of witnesses about. Why did you include this quote in your report?
I think these, let me take a step back with you, and just as you talked to me about my testimony and talked about the fact that I had overall responsibility, I also want to refer you to the fact that we did this we developed this report in conjunction with ORS and with witness Salter. And I think, as you know, he is the policy witness for the ORS on this matter. These considerations of why did we include something from Duke Witness Smith in here is more appropriate for him to discuss with you than me.
Okay.
And I think you've probably seen in the direct testimony, and I could find it for you, where it sort of indicates that we work closely with the ORS, including witness Salter.
Okay, but your testimony addresses the need for new resources, and I think you mentioned this in your summary of ensuring that there's resource adequacy on the system between 2025 and 2029 in response to the significant load growth the company is experiencing. Is that accurate?
Yes. I'm just suggesting that the policy issues, if you're going to get into that, which witness Smith talked about, and how witness Salter discussed, I think that's more appropriate for him.
Okay, understood. And I think your testimony is that it's imperative, and I don't remember if you use that exact word, but I'll adopt it for this person, to take all reasonable steps to ensure there's sufficient resources on the system in the near term to move towards the planning reserve margin of 22%. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you found that 22% planning reserve margin based on a Strape's resource adequacy study to be reasonable for planning purposes?
Yes, we did.
Thank you. And what was notable to me, and I think what I wanted to explore with you, is this quote is just proceeding where the report lists out all of the planned near-term actions that the company is proposing to undertake in a series of bullets across the next 2 pages of the report. So all of the various resources that were selected as part of the P3 fall-based portfolio and are proposed to be either planned, procured, and executed, or as you can see with small modular reactors and offshore wind, initial development work undertaken, but at this juncture, no commitments have been made. Do you see that?
I see the bullets, yes. I agree to the bullets are presented in the report.
Okay. And would you agree with me that at this juncture where there's significant load growth and the company is iteratively planning towards a higher reserve margin, the companies necessarily have to move forward with executing the plan in parallel with the planning process? So we have to move forward on developing and planning and executing these capacity resources to achieve the reliability goals and resource adequacy goals that you've identified as a necessary step in your testimony?
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay. And go ahead.
The question becomes, when the company moves forward with it, the company has to be responsible for execution of execution of the actions that it intends to take. That is the critical issue.
Okay. And
you know, and the question is, if there are modifications to the plan, the company is the party that's responsible. So I think that is something that you Duke discussed with witness Salter.
understood. And so based on your technical review of the modeling and assessment of P3 Paul base, which of these resources should the company not move forward with, if any, in the near term to meet the resource adequacy requirements that you identify as necessary to maintain the reliability of the system and to be able to serve the load growth that is coming to South Carolina and North Carolina?
Right. We didn't necessarily say the company should not move forward with these. We said it's the company's responsibility to manage the process of moving forward with actions that are consistent with the plan that it pursues. The question that we raised in our testimony is the reasonableness of assumptions of the cost assumptions, of the timing assumptions for resources out in the 2032 to 2038 timeframe. And that's a little bit unusual for an IRP. And it's not, in other words, when I look at IRPs and have looked at IRPs, as you're well aware, over many years, I haven't seen an extensive list such as this, that, as you just said, span 2 pages of actions for resources. So we admit that because you're being driven by the goals of retiring coal units, and you're being driven by the goals of a 70% emission reduction by 2035, you're having to take a lot of actions now, and we're not entirely sure that these resources are all ready for prime time. And there's going to be a significant amount of dollars spent. So the question is, should you investigate SMRs? Yes. Should you investigate doing offshore wind? Yes. We're not opposed to you doing that, but the company has to manage the process prudently, and the company has to spend an appropriate amount of money, and those aren't things that we're investigating in this IRP. We can't. Those are things that are going to have to be evaluated in the future with what's known further about things that you don't even have information about in this IRP, especially about those things I just mentioned, offshore wind and nuclear and onshore wind. A lot of these things are to be determined, and there's hundreds of millions of dollars that you intend to spend in the next couple of years. So, and it's not possible, it hasn't been possible for anybody to do a full evaluation of the plans of all those activities, for anybody to say that we bless that, we bless the dollars you're spending, the actions you're taking. Those things are going to be investigated at a future time, and the company will have had to have managed that process prudently and the execution prudently.
Understood. And one thing I'd like to go back to at the beginning of your answer was you were highlighting concerns about long lead time resources like SMRs and offshore wind out into the 2030s, the mid-2030s. Is there anything in the resource plan in the immediate term that the company's planning to execute on that is giving you concerns or pause that's not reasonable for planning purposes?
No, our issues related to things like not meeting the reserve margin target in the short term. It related to the fact that post, the period when you're going to have these resources, in the long term, we feel like the resource plan is being driven by that 70% requirement by 2035. Those were examples of the things. We did not have concerns, nor did we testify to significant issues with the other items that are in the action plan. But again, with those items, just like any of the long-term items, we still suggest that you have to manage that prudently, that process prudently.
Understood. And would you agree that utility management is keenly interested in what the regulator's perspective is on whether to use Ms. Smith's term, on the right track in terms of the resources they're planning to spend material investments on in the near term, whether it's to construct a new combined cycle facility to achieve commercial operation in 2029, or as the initial phase of developing offshore wind that's going to not be commercially operational until the mid-2030s, but those steps have to be taken today to do that initial development work. Is that a prudent decision for management to be seeking that initial clarity and guidance in your perspective?
You are seeking guidance that's going going beyond the pale in that it was and I'm getting into discussions that I think are best suited for Mr. Salter on the issues that he testified to. I didn't testify to the questions that you're asking about whether or not Duke should, the issues got into effectively pre-approval based issues, and I didn't testify on that topic. So I think that it's not appropriate for me to be answering those questions because that's not part of my testimony.
Okay, so the concerns in the report about development of SMRs and offshore wind and that onshore wind being aggressive assumptions, that was not your testimony in the report?
No, I didn't say that.
Okay.
The concerns about the SMRs and the costs and the timing, that was within our purview for review of the IRP, and we reached a conclusion that basically said that we think that Duke's assumptions about those resources are very aggressive. Obviously, there is time, and usually that's the kind of statement that's made, is that there is a long period of time available to adjust plans, and there'll be future IRPs to do it. I think a significant difference in this IRP is the notion that there's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars spent in the next couple of years alone investigating resources that may never come to fruition. So that's a little bit different compared to other IRPs that we have been involved with. And
Okay.
so you are there, one of the questions I think a commissioner asked is, how is this IRP different compared to others? Hundreds of millions of dollars, next couple of years, resources in the 2033 to 2038 time period that the company is investigating and essentially seeking direction that it's okay. And what we're trying to say is the company is, it's appropriate to investigate future resources. All utilities do that. But here, with hundreds of millions of dollars, the company is pushing this issue harder than most utilities I've experienced in other IRPs.
And would you agree with me that the company's been transparent in the way they've presented these plans, costs, investments in a way that is beneficial to the commission, to stakeholders, to the ORS, in understanding what the execution strategy is over the near term and the long term into the mid-2030s? Whether it's, again, doing a solar procurement in 2024, building a combined cycle and getting a CPCN in 2024 to go into service in 2029, or initial planning and requests for information on offshore wind in the mid-2030s?
I'd say not exactly. My answer is basically that the company put forth an IRP that contained what was basically P3 or P1, P2, P3. P1, basically the company ruled out was too aggressive. P2, the company ruled out and said it was also had issues, aggressive, high cost, and it came forth with P3. ORS said, look, the commission in prior orders has requested a P0 to be considered. The commission wants information. And we pushed for that, and the company ultimately provided that. And that provided information. And we were We appreciated the fact that the company provided that information because it was essentially the one portfolio. The company has basically targeted P3, but not as what it considers to be reasonable, but it hasn't looked at anything else until rebuttal testimony. I'm going to try not to get into rebuttal testimony here, but it didn't look at optimizing around P3. And our request was, our F5 recommendation was, and we came to the conclusion with the information the company provided that P0 basically was not risk adjusted. And the company spent a lot of time talking about P0 as if that's something that ORS was promoting. But it was a way of getting information so that we could evaluate something less aggressive even than P3. And we reached the conclusion that there may be something in the middle between P0 and P3 that may be more appropriate for South Carolina customers. And so to answer your question, I think if the company had cooperated, provided something in between the P0, P3, then that would have been a more appropriate information for this commission to be able to analyze and determine whether it thought P3 was appropriate for South Carolina.
Thank you. And Mr. Hitt, to be clear, the company presented P0 in the initial plan consistent with the commission's directive in the 2022 IRP update order, correct?
Correct. And what it led to was a conclusion that P0 is not appropriate, but there could be something less aggressive than P3, and P0 helped to demonstrate that. And we said that we didn't believe it was sufficiently risk adjusted, but we believe that there may be something in between P0 and P3. That was why we called for that analysis. And I won't go into what happened in rebuttal, but additional cases were presented in rebuttal, which helped us to confirm the reasonableness of what we said.
Understood. One final point is you mentioned your experience in other utilities, such as PacifiCorp's IRPs. Recall that? Would you agree with me that PacifiCorp's short-term action plan is comparably detailed to the company's near-term action plan presented in this proceeding?
Again, I would say they provide the detail, and I would say it's probably comparable. I have to put it in front of me and evaluate it and give you an answer to that. I think that Duke and PacifiCorp likely has a reasonable level of detail in the action plan. However, there's a lot of information that's to come. There's a lot of information about the viability of projects that are to be determined. And for anybody to say that this is the plan that should be established, it appears to be a very aggressive plan with resources out in the future that are somewhat unknown.
But Mr. Hayden, isn't that the beauty? I'm sorry, but isn't that the beauty of the way Act 62 is designed? Is that it allows for check and adjust their annual updates, their IRPs every 3 years, and so the companies will report to the commission on how execution is evolving, what material changes in inputs and assumptions happen related to that preferred portfolio or the most reasonable and prudent plan approved by the commission in those intermediate years. Isn't that what the statute's designed to solve for?
Yes, and we agree with that. But again, the company has to be responsible for all the action it takes with that, and the spending of hundreds of millions of dollars is something that, maybe the number should be half that. Maybe it should be, 3/4 of what the company's planning. That's for the company to determine what's the appropriate thing to evaluate these projects that may never materialize. That's one point I'd make, but there may also be a less aggressive time frame, and we've seen there are benefits of less aggressive time frame in rebuttal information that supports that notion.
No further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Hayes.
Thank you. Any questions, Sierra Club, Ms. Jaffe?
No questions, thank you.
CCL SACE,
No questions.
Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association,
No questions. Here we go.
Walmart.
Red light on.
No questions, thank you.
All right. And this witness will be back on rebuttal, is that correct? Is there any commissioner questions at this time?
That is.
We will reserve our questioning for later. All right.
I have a brief redirect.
Any redirect?
Yes. Mr. Hayes.
Yes.
On cross-examination, you were asked some questions in regard to dual state efficiencies in planning. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you were also indicated to turn to page 9 of the ORS report. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay. A paragraph above where you were sent before, I would say the second paragraph down in the paragraph. As it relates to dual state planning efficiency, the report quotes a order 2022-643. Do you see that?
Hang on. Would you direct me again? The paragraph.
Page 9.
Yeah, page 9, the paragraph.
The second paragraph.
That I was directed to is while the company's IRP.
No, go above that. It's the second paragraph on the page.
You're running into the same problem with the pagination
Okay,
that I had earlier.
it's page 9 on the bottom of the report. And it's
okay.
the second paragraph from the top.
A robust and equitable comparison.
Correct. Do you see that reference to order
Yes,
2022-6?
2022-643.
As it relates to dual state efficiencies, can you read what the commission ordered there?
Yes, dual state planning efficiencies, while in consideration, do not obviate the need for an IRP to comply with the applicable IRP principles in the context of existing South Carolina statutes and regulations.
Thank you. And also you were asked questions about the near-term action plan. Do you recall that?
Yeah.
And specifically, you were asked questions as it relates to whether you had concerns with different aspects of that. Do you recall that question?
Yes.
Isn't it correct ORS conducted its review of the company's IRP as a whole, the 15-year period that is outlined in the statute?
Yes, we did.
Thank you. That's all.
Any recross company? Any other recross? Thank you very much. That would you like to excuse the witness for now?
Yes, I would. Thank you.
Okay, you may step down.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we are back to the rebuttal.
Yes, sir. The companies would call Mr. Tim Duff to the witness stand.
Thank you. Could we take about a 10-minute break? And then we'll be right back. Thank you. We're back on the record on Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolina's Integrated Resource Plan, docket number 2023-8-E and 2023-10-E. We're beginning some of the rebuttal testimony from the company. Just want to remind everyone we do have our business meeting at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, which means we will resume this hearing tomorrow morning at 10. So you get a little break tomorrow. And we'll continue with the rebuttal testimony. I guess we'll be through with everything by lunchtime tomorrow, won't we? Okay. Guess not. Mr. Gissendammer.
The companies have called Tim Duff to the stand.
Mr. Duff, if you'd raise your right hand, do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Duff, please state your name for the record.
My name is Timothy J. Duff.
And are you the same Timothy J. Duff that previously appeared and presented direct testimony in this proceeding?
Yes.
And Mr. Duff, did you prepare or cause to be prepared 23 pages of rebuttal testimony that were pre-filed with the commission in this proceeding?
Yes.
And do you have any corrections to that pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
Yes. I have one minor correction to page 11, line 5 and 6 of my testimony. It should read, Duncan's claims related to distributed energy resources rather than distribution resource planning.
Okay, and so that I'm clear, on page 11, lines 5 through 6, you are striking distribution resource planning and inserting the words distributed energy resources.
Yes, that's correct.
And subject to that correction, if I asked you the same questions that were asked in your pre-filed rebuttal testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, I would ask that Mr. Duff's pre-filed rebuttal testimony, as corrected from the stand, be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
The pre-filed rebuttal testimony, as corrected from the stand, will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Duff, would you please provide a summary of your rebuttal testimony?
Sure. In my rebuttal testimony, I respond to recommendations regarding the company's EE and DSM efforts in direct testimony of the ORS and certain interveners. Importantly, the company's efforts to date have placed them as leaders in the Southeast in achieving energy savings for their customers through their EE DSM programs. The companies continue to aggressively pursue additional offerings that are designed to drive even more EE savings to help the companies reach savings equal to 1% of eligible retail sales, an aggressive but achievable goal. Relevant to this proceeding, the company's EE DSM offerings contain unique characteristics distinguishing them from supply-side investments included in the IRP. For example, the companies cannot simply invest in EE/DSM resources and add them to their resource plans like traditional supply-side investments. EE/DSM resources require a specific customer investment and behavioral change or acceptance, which CCL at-large witness Rampani ignores when recommending that the companies include more such resources in the IRP. CCL witness-at-large witness Duncan also incorrectly claims that the IRP did not adequately consider behind-the-meter storage. As my testimony explains, the IRP appropriately considered behind-the-meter storage, accounting for a limited scale of its adoption and lack of data regarding system impacts and resource values that can be realized. Assuming theoretical behind-the-meter storage amounts extrapolated from national data or generic high-level studies that do not adequately account for the company's specific service territories would be imprudent. However, the companies recently obtained approval for programs that may provide relevant insight and inform the company's ability to appropriately reflect behind-the-meter storage in future modeling. But the data necessary to perform such modeling does not presently exist. Witness Duncan also alleges that the companies failed to account for managed charging and EV load forecasts and virtual power plants in their IRP modeling.
but the companies considered and included both items. With respect to EV load, the company's forecasts include the load shaping benefits of the company's TOU rates that encourage off-peak charging in a manner like the managed charging Witness Duncan sites. Likewise, although the precise definition of virtual power plant varies, the company's IRP includes hundreds of megawatts of capacity from programs that allow the companies to dispatch customer-sited resources. While the companies may not have labeled these resources exactly as Witness Duncan would, the IRP already incorporates the capacity associated with these virtual power plant resources. CCL at Large Witness, Turk, suggests the companies develop a bring your own battery program and lays out specific aspects of the program to be included in the program. However, this recommendation ignores the recent approval of very similar programs in South Carolina, which eliminate the need for the recommendation. The companies are hopeful that the data from these recently approved programs will inform the 2025 IRP update and future IRPs. Finally, Witness Rapani and Walmart Witness Perry make limited recommendations regarding large customer program development. The companies appreciate the perspective and will continue to regularly engage large customers, including through the EEDSM Collaborative, to develop additional programs to benefit these customers and supplement offerings such as the recently redesigned TOU tariffs, the hourly pricing signals, and the Premier Power and on-site generation programs. This concludes my rebuttal testimony summary.
Thank you, Mr. Duff. Please answer any questions of council or the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Gissendown. Any questions from Sierra Club?
No questions, thank you.
CCL says upstate forever and vote solar.
Thank you, Chair Powers. Good afternoon, Mr. Duff. Thomas Gooding on behalf of CCL et al.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Duff, your testimony and Appendix H of the company's IRP concern grid edge and customer programs like energy efficiency, demand response, and distributed energy resources, correct?
Correct.
And you testified that those programs are critical to shrinking the challenge.
Correct.
And by that, you mean that they help to reduce load or shift energy usage to off-peak times, with the goal of deferring or even eliminating the need for new generation. Is that correct?
Yes, they would minimize the need for some traditional supply-side investment.
Thank you. And there are many types of grid edge programs, but I'd like to focus on demand response for a moment. Specifically, in your adopted direct and rebuttal testimony, you refer to modifications to the company's power manager and load control programs that this commission recently approved. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And specifically, those modifications provide a new battery control option for program participants, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And this battery control option allows Duke to charge, discharge, and store energy using the customer's battery to shift load or provide energy when the grid is constrained. Yes?
It allows the company to charge and discharge the battery, yes.
Okay. And would you agree that it can provide storage and dispatch capability to the system, resulting in a reduction in energy and capacity needs?
It's specifically designed to reduce peak capacity needs, yes.
Okay. And in return for participating, customers receive a monthly incentive, $6.50 per kilowatt, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. But that's not an upfront incentive to acquire battery resources, right?
No, it's not.
Okay. So to put a finer point on it, to participate in the program, the customers would have to already have eligible battery resources installed in their homes. Is that correct?
The program is open to customers who already have battery resources installed in their homes, as well as a customer who might choose to invest in a new battery.
Okay, thank you. And Duke filed this same battery control modification to its residential demand response program in North Carolina, right?
Yes.
And in addition to the battery control modification, Duke also filed and recently launched the Power Pair pilot in North Carolina, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And the Power Pair pilot incentivizes eligible residential homeowners to install solar panels and a battery storage system that in turn provide benefits to the grid, right?
Yes, the pilot requires customers to install a certain amount, limited amount of solar and battery capacity. And for that, they may receive a upfront installation incentive.
Okay, great. And participants are split into two cohorts, correct? Cohort A participants are served under time of use rates, while cohort B participants would be required to participate in that battery control program that we just discussed. Is that correct?
So if a customer, there are two cohorts currently, and yes, a customer may either choose to participate and not have the utility have any control over the system, and that would be cohort A and be served under the TOU rates that were associated with the net metering reform. And then cohort B, they would be served under the bridge rate, subject to the bridge cap in North Carolina. But then, yes, they would be required to participate in the battery demand response program.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And so in addition to the upfront monetary incentive to acquire the resource, those cohort B participants would also receive the monthly incentive for their participation under the battery control option.
That's correct.
Okay. And you would agree that a goal of Power Pair is to incentivize and enable more customers to adopt behind the meter storage and solar because it provides that upfront payment to customers. Is that fair?
So I think it was designed to get learnings. It was designed to get learnings about the potential of customers' interest to allow for control of their storage systems with solar. But it was not filed, nor was it approved as an EEDSM program. It's under a different framework in North Carolina. It just so happens that it works. The one cohort does require participation in a DSM program.
Okay. And just to clarify, in your rebuttal testimony on page 12, lines 3 through 4,
I'm there.
Okay. It looks like you note that slower adoption of solar with behind the meter storage was one of the reasons the companies developed the Power Pair pilot. Would you agree?
Yes, with the net metering reform that was going on, we were seeing slower adoption of solar and storage.
Okay, great. And by reducing the upfront cost of battery storage for participants, the companies are making these resources more accessible to a broader range of customers who may not otherwise be able to afford behind the meter storage. Is that right?
I think the design was to remove some of the financial barriers. Obviously, there's tax credits and other incentives available.
Okay. And if more customers have access to these resources and participate in Power Pair, the companies have more resources to shrink the challenge. Is that a fair statement?
So I would kind of disagree with both cohorts, because the system benefits of a customer owning storage and solar without having any sort of utility control is very limited and really unknown. So that's why none of the incentives that were modeled in Power Pair were tested for cost effectiveness. Only the demand response program was modeled to look at cost effectiveness, because it's the only one that's providing system benefits, known system benefits to all utility customers.
Okay. And out of curiosity, do you know what percentage of participants who sought to enroll in the program sought to enroll in cohort B with the demand response?
So cohort B, the last I saw was above 90% of the customers had enrolled in cohort B.
Okay, so there's a lot of interest in this demand response component. Is that fair to say?
Yes. In fact, it's really interesting to note that we've seen such interest in it since it's rolled out really in 3 months in North Carolina, that almost 30% of customers were actually pre-existing storage customers. So it's not necessarily that upfront incentive that's getting them motivated to participate in the DR. The demand response incentive has been very motivating. As I said, 30% of the total was actually existing storage capacity that was out there.
Okay, let's get into the amount of participation that you've seen in PowerPair, because I think that would help us understand how the upfront incentive plays out. Do you know actually to date how many participants in PowerPair there are?
Let's see. It may not be 100% up to date, but I have a rough number, yeah.
Okay.
We have accepted approximately 1,700 applications as being valid.
Okay. Do you know roughly how many megawatts of behind the meter storage that comes out to?
I don't know about the storage component necessarily of the solar capacity, because that's one of the limits. We're at about 15.8 megawatts.
Okay. Great.
That's across both DEP and DC.
Okay.
It's a 60 megawatt total for the two utilities combined.
Okay. Thank you for
So
that.
about 25%.
clarification. Okay. And if I understand correctly, that means 70% of that roughly was not in the pre-existing program. Did I understand that correctly?
No. What I was saying was that of the demand response participation that we've seen, only 70% of the total is associated with PowerPair. We've seen 30% of the total come outside, meaning that DR incentive is motivating to get existing storage, which isn't open to the PowerPair pilot, to participate in the DR program.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. And overall, given these numbers, you'd say that the pilot has been successful so far, wouldn't you?
So it has definitely attracted interest. What I would say is we are tracking it. Some of the solar developers, they were actually instrumental in the design. Originally, it was going to be a 20 megawatt a year for 3 years, and they felt there was going to be so much strong upfront demand that they wanted all 60 opened up right away. So we're only about a quarter in, but obviously, I think we're excited that customers are intrigued by both the PowerPair component as well as the storage demand response component.
Great. If you could turn to page 14, lines 14 to 15 of your rebuttal testimony for me.
Sure. I'm sorry, what lines were that?
14 through 15.
Okay.
And there you say that a similar pilot that promotes residential customer installation of rooftop solar and behind the meter storage has not been filed in South Carolina. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So turning to behind the meter storage generally, you have stated in your rebuttal testimony that the companies noted an uptick in customers attaching battery storage to their solar arrays between 2019 and 2022. Is that correct?
So I believe that was company witness Reed, and she is correct that number went up. Interestingly enough, I looked at it, and in 2023 it went back down. So we're trying to figure out what that means, but there was a dip back actually down to pre-2021, back down to 2020 levels in 2023. But previously, from 19 to 2022, it had gone up, yes.
Okay. And it went up, if I recall correctly, tenfold. Is that correct?
It went from approximately 1% to 10%, correct.
Okay. And the Inflation Reduction Act also provides a tax incentive to customers for acquiring battery storage. I think you mentioned that before, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And overall, battery costs are declining. Would you agree with that?
I'm not an expert on the battery costs. I know they're very expensive.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you. But the companies didn't model a behind-the-meter storage forecast. Is that right?
So we did, in terms of what was included in the grid edge forecast, we did not have an explicit behind-the-meter storage forecast. We looked at it, and in South Carolina, from kind of when we started tracking net metering to kind of up through 2023, we were at a little under, I believe, 5 megawatts of total storage capability. So it's still a very nascent, kind of growing, and we really don't have a lot of understanding of what that resource can be controlled for. So as we continue to see adoption, and as we understand what the storage can be utilized as in terms of like being a VPP and dispatchable through demand response programs, then in future IRPs, we think it's appropriate to forecast. But right now, we're still learning. We don't have enough information in South Carolina to try and say, hey, this much is going to be out there. And again, given the current scale, it is very small in terms of trying to understand what kind of uptick you would see.
Okay. So even though we discussed the Inflation Reduction Act and potentially battery costs declining, even if they're still expensive, as well as these new modifications to the demand response programs here in South Carolina, plus the Power Pair program in North Carolina, and the resulting increase in interest in battery attachment that we've seen, the companies still effectively have zero behind the meter storage on their system given this lack of a forecast.
Well, so I want to correct that a little bit. So the current load forecast has that 5 megawatts of South Carolina storage that's out there. It's built into the load for it, but we don't control it, so we don't know it. And frankly, at the time of filing this, we didn't have any sort of control program out there, which is really where we can kind of forecast an impact into the load forecast and put it as a supply on a kind of par with the supply side resource in our DSM forecast.
Okay. In addition, there was also testimony regarding virtual power plants or VPPs. And your testimony states that, in your view at least, a VPP comprises grid edge resources that can be controlled or dispatched by utility like a traditional supply side resource or like a conventional power plant. Does that sound right?
Yeah, like a traditional supply side resource, yes.
Okay, thank you. And would you agree that the VPP program proposed in Mr. Turk's testimony has many characteristics in common with the Power Pair pilot that the companies are offering in North Carolina?
Yeah, it has an ongoing dispatchable control. I will say that Mr. Turk obviously was somewhat unaware of our program, and I think he continues to be. There were a couple of things that he just was misinformed on. For example, we have 36 events, not 27 that he referenced. And I know he just read about it, and it was just recently approved, in fairness to him, at the end of July, beginning of August. So yes, there is a control or dispatch capability of a customer-owned battery. That's a very similar feature, yes.
Okay, and plus the upfront incentive.
Well, that's the difference, is I believe Mr. Turk was proposing an upfront incentive.
Similar to Power Pair.
Well, right. I think he was bundling the two together. Sure. And again, that's where we struggled, because Mr. Turk, and he acknowledged, he didn't provide any cost effectiveness analysis. And when you start looking at the incentive levels, when you're looking at up to a $5,400 upfront incentive through Power Pair for storage, you tack on $3,600 up to for the solar, you're talking about a big incentive piece. That's not EEDSM cost effective. So we modeled a demand response program that we thought would be effective for getting control of the dispatch. It's not designed to promote customers to install. It's designed to say, if you have installed, we would pay you for the ability to dispatch it and control it in like a VPP.
Okay. Just to make sure that we're not talking past each other, the Power Pair pilot has many similarities with what Mr. Turk has presented here. Is that correct?
There are similarities, but there are also differences.
Sure.
There's a requirement for solar, which, as I said, that's another $3,600 of incentive from the company, as well as thousands of dollars out of the customer's pocket. And then on top of that, like I said, you do have the upfront incentive that's quite sizable, as I said, up to $5,400, which, again, we were able to do that under a different framework in North Carolina. It didn't have to go through EEDSM cost effectiveness. And our modifications to EnergyWise and Power Managers include that battery DR. They are cost effective. not super high. They're in the 1.5 range under the UCT. But again, it's important to note that the UCT doesn't look at the customer's out-of-pocket cost. So we're looking at it from the utility perspective. We're looking at it from what we're paying for the dispatch and the value that that dispatch brings to the system.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
No further questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gooding. Next would be Sasiba. Any questions?
No questions.
Walmart,
No questions, thank you.
ORS.
No questions, thank you.
All right, Commissioners, Commissioner Williams.
Thank you, Chair Powers. As you look at the clock, I do have a number of questions, so I'll say that from the outset. Mr. Duff, in your direct testimony and the summary, you talked at the bottom of the first page, you talk about the EE savings and the differences between DEC and DEP, and 11% for DEP and 18% for DEC. Did I get that right? And I wanted to understand what those percentages were and why the difference in the two territories.
So this is really a kind of a result of the modeling. It's a great question, because when we looked at it, we increased, when you look at 2022 to 2023, the biggest change is the load forecast, which impacts the eligible retail sales. And then when you've created a floor of 1% of eligible retail sales, it's going to change. Obviously, there's different load growth across the two different jurisdictions, and so that's why you see the difference. Basically, that number that you're multiplying to get the 1% of eligible retail sales has grown differently between the two different utilities.
So there's more growth in the DEC area.
Correct.
Okay. You probably don't need to look at this, but page 6, lines 5 through 8 of your rebuttal testimony, you talk about the data necessary for performing the modeling and that it does not exist. Is that because of where you were in the battery pilot programs at the time? When do you expect that information to be available?
Sure. So, I think both Witness Turk and Witness Duncan talk about a lot of behind-the-meter programs. There's been a lot of pilots, and, we're excited that the commission approved our demand response program. If you note, one of the features of that is that monthly incentive, which is at $6.50 per kW per the nameplate continuous dispatch capability, is multiplied by an availability factor. We know batteries may not, if a customer uses it, it may not be available. We went out and looked and came up with 70%. And in that filing, you'll probably remember, we said we'll update that as we learn. There's a great example of we just don't know. We don't know how much we're going to be able to get from that nameplate capacity when we go to dispatch it. And so to start modeling the impacts that it can have to the system peaks, which is really where we see this, similar to our other demand response programs currently in the IRP process, it made sense to say, we need to learn. We need to see how many customers are participating. And then once we have those customers participating, we can start doing the measurement and verification that we do for all of our DSM programs to really understand the South Carolina and Duke specific impacts of a battery program.
Do you imagine that you will have better data for updates or for the next comprehensive IRP?
Very much so. Like I said, these programs were just approved.
Right.
And so if we would have modeled something, it would have modeled something that really didn't know what the commission would approve or how customers would behave. And so we we recognize that this is something that is growing and coming, but to put it into the IRP today, particularly behind the meter where it's all driven by customer uptake, we're very encouraged that our $6.50 per month per kW of continuous of the continuous,
I'm glad you're saying it.
the continuous dispatch nameplate capability of the unit. That's what we need to learn. And so we're excited by it. We want to learn. We want to start calling events. But I mean, it just launched in South Carolina.
Right.
So we don't even have any events run yet. So that was why I did in my rebuttal testimony put the caveat that we do need to have data. Now, what we've seen in North Carolina and the interest we've seen with existing batteries, we are excited and think we will have the data, but we do want it to be data driven. The IRP is not about program design. It's about resource planning. And so you really need to understand what the resource is for us to give a forecast to be included in the resource planning modeling.
I don't expect you to be able to respond to this, but the conundrum I see is with behind the resource battery storage or paired, you've got a program and you're looking at specific numbers. You know that in the future you're going to have specific numbers. We've got an IRP where that same discussion is happening with things that are in beyond the near term but are starting to be planned in the near term for elements like offshore wind, onshore wind, small nuclear reactors. And I think it's a conundrum for probably all of us in the room because you've got experience. You're actively going after that experience in one particular element, and you're saying we don't have the data. And in another, there's a lot of unknowns, but we're estimating big numbers. Again, I just felt compelled to say that. You can respond to it if you choose to, but you don't have to.
I understand the conundrum. I think it's probably a better question for Mr. Snyder or Mr. Quinto, who actually handle the modeling of the resources and kind of are putting them on a like basis. What I will say is that, we do, once we have programs and see experience, we do forecast out future participation. And I think that, that was one of the things that I really struggled with was the critique about VPPs, because I even heard Witness Turk talk about smart thermostat programs being a VPP, and even Witness Duncan himself in his testimony, in his direct testimony, I think on page 22, table 1, he included a smart thermostat program, that is offered by APS, which is almost identical to the one that Duke has. And Duke's won awards. In 2022, we had the largest smart thermostat program in the country. So we aggressively pursue these resources. And once we have those resources and understand them, we have an aggressive forecast in the IRP for smart thermostat VPPs. We didn't call them VPPs. We called them DSM because that's how they were approved and that's what we run them under. But we'll put resources in as we have comfort that we know that we can make a reasonable forecast as to their adoption, as well as understanding what the actual impact is.
Did you just say BSN? You used an acronym that I couldn't follow you on.
BSN. DSM.
DSM. Okay.
DSM. I apologize.
No, you don't need to. You're doing far better at the end of the day than I am. In thinking about, do you work at all with the EDSM for industrial businesses and large customers?
Both residential and non-residential.
Okay. What has your collaborative suggested to improve participation rates in those categories?
So one of the things that we're really looking across the Carolinas in our portfolio is to look at the system values that are associated with them. And as you probably know, they update over time as IRPs and avoided costs update. And so we're really looking right now at our incentive levels to see if maybe we need to up the incentive levels to try and be more reflective of the system benefits. Obviously, there's been a lot of inflation you're looking at a lot of expensive resources in the IRP. So we want to make sure that our incentives and our programs are structured so they're still cost effective, but maybe increasing the incentives to customers to try and attract more participation. And we continually have stakeholder engagements. We're talking to large customers and customer groups about things like backup generators. We're talking about things like CHP. We're looking across the board to try and find opportunities for them to participate in the programs. EE is a tough thing for those customers in many cases because a lot of customers, electricity isn't a huge piece of their operating costs. So
it's not
for a lot of them. But there is a new type of load coming but it's being built at a very high efficient level. And so there isn't a ton of opportunity there. It was talked about my direct testimony with the economic development. And so we're looking, but I think the primary thing we're doing is trying to take customer feedback as well as really trying to look at the value proposition and make sure that we're maintaining cost effectiveness for all customers, but potentially increasing incentives. And obviously, we'll be sharing those with stakeholders and the commission as we kind of come up with new proposals.
Any thoughts about reducing the amount of opt-outs?
So that is a continued challenge. I think that one of the things that we know is that they're very economically savvy. And so that's why we're optimistic that the increase in incentives could spur more interest and change the economics for a customer to participate.
And confidentiality agreements don't help you with opt-outs?
That's not really been a huge issue. Obviously, there is a concern that's always been expressed of they don't want everybody knowing they don't want their competition knowing what they're doing. But mostly, we really hear it's an economics issue,
which is what we heard yesterday. I think it was. Okay. Let's shift to EV adoption rates and future IRPs. Are hybrid vehicles influencing are they included in those EV adoption rates?
So I don't believe that the EV numbers include hybrids.
Right.
I think that's kind of pure EVs. A lot of it has to do with the charging information.
Right.
So I think that the EV forecast is based off of kind of a pure EV adoption, but that would probably be a better question for Mr. Stillman and the load forecasters.
Well, okay, and you're probably going to say the same thing to the next question. So, so we do have on page 25 of the IRP a table that shows the forecasted sales in the combined Duke system with a compounded annual growth rate of 37.2% over the span of the IRP. What do you know the source of that forecast, and is it reasonable?
Is that for EVs?
Yes.
So again, that's a better question for them. I believe it comes from a VAST model, but again, I would let Mr. Stillman get into the details of that. I think with respect to what I talked about on EVs, we just wanted everyone to understand that the company assumed what we know is kind of a TOU charging load shape.
Yeah.
So we didn't assume business as usual. They just charge whenever. I know there was a lot of concerns about managed charging. That's something that's we've run pilots. We've seen some struggles with some of the telemetry that's been promised to manage charging. So we didn't have a lot of data on, quote, that firm charging, but we did in fact see a significant reduction in the peak contribution in winter and summer by using those TOU rate load shapes associated with charging. I think it was about 15%.
Reduction in peak.
Reduction versus if it was just assuming plain charging.
But you didn't model managed.
No, we didn't
For
have
the
any
reasons
real
you said.
data to manage that.
Right. I think we have covered a lot of this. Remind me why the North Carolina Power Pair program was not brought to South Carolina.
So the North Carolina Power Pair pilot was actually something that the commission ordered us to offer. It is run through the renewable energy, the REPS program in the state, which is about renewable, and there is a components of efficiency, but it's a renewable portfolio standard. And so those costs are outside of EE and DSM. And like I said, because of that different structure, we are able to do it. But if we were forced to try and do it in, say, the DSM framework, it would not be cost effective. And even including an upfront incentive on top of the DR would be a problem. As I said, we're only at about a 1.5 on the cost effectiveness scale, and that's before we know whether that 70.9 availability percent is accurate or not. So we're really excited that customers are signing up with their existing storage. That tells us that it's meaningful. It's not just something that's out there that they're not willing to try and do. So like I said, that 30% of the total so far to sign up is really exciting.
Thank you very much. My apologies to the whole room for having to ask a question that, as you talked, I knew the answer to. So, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Commissioner Castley.
If I may follow up on that, I wanted to make sure I understood it to that different framework you're talking about. You mentioned Commissioner C. Williams, that the difference between the program in North Carolina is that it's not an EEDSM program and you pay the customer. Is that correct?
Yes, the customer receives an incentive for installing the equipment. There's no assumed system benefits from just the installation of a customer installing the solar and storage.
So with that program in North Carolina, the company would not recognize, well, all right. In South Carolina, if it's EEDSM, the company receives net loss revenue. Is that correct? As one of the
to the extent there's a reduction in energy sales for EE programs, yes, there would be lost revenues, and in North Carolina it would be similar as well. If it was an EEDSM program.
So that's the distinction. In North Carolina, it's not, and in South Carolina, it is.
It's a different framework. No, I didn't say that. As I said, we were ordered to offer the program. We were told that it would be offered and funded by customers through the REPS rider in North Carolina. So it wasn't like we proposed it as an EEDSM program and we were told that was the appropriate place for that pilot program to be funded.
Okay. One final question. I've tried to figure this out and I've not been able to. Do you know what the total cost for all the programs are for DEC, DEP in South Carolina for the I wrote it down, the non-incentive program cost, the incentives, the net loss revenue, any other cost? Do you know what that total cost is?
So I think I don't know that number off the top of my head. The appropriate place to find those would be in the company's annual EEDSM rider proceedings. You'd have to add the two DEP and DC together, but that's where we report out the costs in that manner.
I've looked at that, and maybe it is just adding those, but I couldn't determine if it included all those. It looked like the non-incentive program cost was different or wasn't included. are all those costs included in those numbers in that report?
In the right of recovery, yes, there's both the customer incentive costs as well as the non-incentive program costs such as EM&V, implementation, et cetera.
Thank you. And again, I'm sorry that stays so long. Thank you.
Not all. That's why I'm here.
Any further commissioner questions? Any redirect from the company?
No redirect. We'd ask that Mr. Duff be excused.
Mr. Duff, you're done.
Thank you.
I think we're all done too. So we will see you at 10 o'clock in the morning, and we are adjourned.